Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Me, my brother Ethan, his girlfriend Jess, and my best friend Marcus decided to camp in Black Hollow Forest, a remote stretch of wilderness miles from the nearest town. It had been my idea, just a few days away from the city, deep in nature, where the stars were bright and the air was fresh. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The trees were taller than I'd imagined, ancient and twisted, their gnarled branches blocking out most of the sky. The ground was soft and uneven, and the deeper we went into the forest, the thicker the mist became. It clung to our clothes and faces, swirling in strange patterns that seemed to move with purpose, though I told myself it was just my imagination. We set up camp in a small clearing by a creek. The sun was setting, casting long, pale shadows across the ground. Jess made a comment about how quiet it was. Too quiet. I laughed it off, but she was right. There were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the trees, just the soft trickle of water and the occasional crackle of dead leaves underfoot. Still, we tried to enjoy the night. We made a fire, cooked dinner, and cracked open a few beers. For a while, the tension faded. The flames danced, casting warm light on our faces, and the mist retreated to the edges of the clearing. We talked, joked, and shared stories. But as the night wore on, the uneasy feeling returned. The mist crept back in, thickening as the temperature dropped. It swirled around our feet, and every now and then I thought I saw shapes, figures, lurking just beyond the firelight. I shook it off. It was just mist, after all. My mind was playing tricks on me. Around midnight, Marcus suggested we explore the area. He had a cheap thrill for anything spooky, and Black Hollow Forest was known for its ghost stories, tales of hikers vanishing, strange lights in the sky, and the whispers. Ethan and Jess weren't keen on the idea, but Marcus and I grabbed our flashlights and headed out, leaving them by the fire. We walked for a while, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the dense fog. The deeper we went, the more the air felt wrong. It was cold, much colder than it should have been for early autumn. The mist thickened, becoming almost solid in places, swirling in strange, unnatural patterns. Every step we took seemed muffled, like the forest was swallowing the sound. Then Marcus stopped, pointing ahead. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I squinted into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and trees. But then, about 50 yards ahead, something moved. It was faint, like a shimmer of light, a figure barely visible through the mist. It was human-shaped, but pale, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Probably another camper," I muttered, though I knew it wasn't. No one else had been on the trail when we hiked in. This forest was isolated, completely off the beaten path. And who would be out here alone in the dead of night? Before I could say anything more, Marcus started walking toward the figure. I grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait, we don't know what that is." But he shook me off, flashing me a grin. "It's probably nothing, dude. Just someone messing around. Let's go check it out." Reluctantly, I followed. As we got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was standing with her back to us, her long dark hair hanging down over her shoulders, her white dress rippling in the mist. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. "Hello?" Marcus called out. "You okay?" No response. "Maybe we should just head back," I said, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Marcus ignored me, stepping closer. "Hey, are you—" Before he could finish, the figure vanished. Not slowly, not fading into the mist, just gone. One moment she was there, the next, nothing. The mist swirled where she had stood, thick and heavy, but there was no sign of her. Marcus turned to me, his face pale. "Did you see that?" I nodded, unable to speak. We stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, from behind us, we heard a sound, a low, whispering voice, so faint it was barely audible. It was impossible to make out the words, but it was coming from the direction of the camp. Without a word, we turned and ran. When we burst back into the clearing, Ethan and Jess were still sitting by the fire, but something was wrong. They weren't moving, just sitting there, staring into the flames, their faces pale and blank. "Guys?" I called out, my voice shaky. They didn't respond. I rushed over, grabbing Ethan's shoulder, shaking him. His eyes were wide open, but he didn't blink, didn't react. He just kept staring into the fire. "Something's wrong," Marcus whispered, backing away. Then I saw it, the mist. It had thickened around the campsite, forming a solid wall just beyond the firelight. Shapes moved in the mist, pale human-like figures, circling us, their faces blurred and indistinct. One of them stepped forward, just close enough for me to see. It was the woman from before, her dark hair hanging over her face, her white dress flowing unnaturally. She raised her head slowly, and when I saw her face, my blood ran cold. She had no eyes, just hollow black voids where they should have been, and her mouth hung open, wide, as if screaming silently. I stumbled back, dragging Ethan with me. "We need to go, now." But Ethan didn't move, neither did Jess. They were frozen, unresponsive as the figures in the mist closed in. Marcus grabbed my arm, his face pale with terror. "We need to leave them." "I'm not leaving my brother," I shouted, but deep down I knew Marcus was right. Something was wrong with them, something we couldn't fix. Suddenly the whispering returned, louder this time, filling the clearing with its strange, disjointed murmur. The figures in the mist were closer now, reaching out with skeletal hands, their eyeless faces fixed on us. Marcus yanked me back and we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, breathless and shaking. When I turned to look back, the mist was still there, hanging over the trees like a blanket. But the figures were gone. We drove back to town in silence. We never talked about what happened. Not to each other, not to anyone. Ethan and Jess were never found. The authorities said they must have gotten lost in the woods, but I knew better. Sometimes late at night I still hear the whispers, and sometimes I swear I can see them standing in the mist just beyond the edge of the trees. I didn't plan on going camping that weekend. My friend Jake had backed out at the last minute, leaving me with a packed car, 2 days off, and no real reason to stick around. I decided to go solo. It wasn't my first time camping alone, and the idea of escaping into the wilderness for a few nights sounded perfect until I got there. I chose a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place I'd never been but had read about online. Remote, picturesque, and far from the reach of cell towers. The drive up was uneventful, the dense forest on either side of the narrow road swallowing the last bits of daylight. By the time I reached the trailhead, dusk was already settling in, casting everything in a deep golden glow. There was an oddness to the place, though. It started the moment I parked and stepped out of the car. The air was thick, unusually still. No wind, no distant calls of birds or insects. Just the oppressive silence that made the forest feel too empty. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to arriving at an off hour, when the forest was perhaps in transition from day to night. I hiked in about an hour, deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail that seemed to vanish the further I went. The trees here were ancient, tall, twisted, their branches thick with moss that dripped down like tattered curtains. Eventually I found a clearing that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, far from the beaten path. It was perfect. Setting up my tent, I noticed something strange. The trees. At the edge of the clearing, they all seemed to lean inward, as if they were growing toward me, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes, almost as though they were watching. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just the way the trees had adapted to the terrain. The forest can play tricks on you like that. Night fell quickly, as it does in places like this, and before I knew it, the only light was the flicker of my campfire and the dim glow of my lantern. I sat by the fire, eating my dinner and listening to the crackle of the flames, trying to shake the nagging feeling that something was off. But it was hard to ignore. The silence, no, the absence of sound, was absolute. Not a single cricket, not a rustle of leaves, nothing. As I stared into the fire, I heard it for the first time, a faint whisper carried on the still air. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I tried to brush it off as the wind, but deep down I knew there had been no wind. A chill crept down my spine, and I glanced around the clearing, my eyes darting between the shadows. Nothing, just darkness and the trees. I went back to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing up as if someone, or something, was right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but again, there was nothing. Just those damn trees, their branches swaying in the slightest of breezes, despite the stillness of the night. I tried to distract myself, poking at the fire and telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. I was alone deep in the woods, and that kind of isolation can mess with your mind. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Something was wrong. Then out of nowhere, the fire went out. Not gradually, like it would if it were burning low, but all at once, like someone had snuffed it out with a blanket. The lantern beside me flickered and died as well, plunging me into complete darkness. Panic set in. I scrambled for my flashlight, hands shaking, and when I flicked it on, the beam cut through the night, revealing nothing, just trees. But the whisper returned, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't just a sound, it was words. Faint, disjointed words, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I shone the flashlight around, trying to find the source, but no matter where I pointed it, the beam only revealed more shadows, more trees, all leaning in toward me, their branches curling like fingers. The whispering grew louder, coming from all around me now. I couldn't understand the words, but they were there, overlapping, like voices talking over each other. I grabbed my pack, ready to run, but the moment I stood, something caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the light, half hidden among the trees. It was pale, almost featureless, and tall, far too tall to be human. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it sway gently, unnaturally, like it was tethered to the ground by invisible strings. I backed up slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam bouncing off the trees. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices now, each one overlapping the next, filling the clearing with a maddening, unintelligible hum. And then, as quickly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I ran. I didn't care where. I just ran. Branches slapped at my face. Roots tried to trip me, but I kept going, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly in the dark. Behind me, I could hear something moving, fast, impossibly fast, through the underbrush, gaining on me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the trees, gasping for breath, every part of me screaming to get out, to escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the forest opened up, and I burst out onto the dirt road where I had parked my car. I fumbled for my keys, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, turned the key, and gunned it down the road, not stopping until I hit the highway miles later. The whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the car. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up the entire time, and every so often, I could swear I caught movement in the rearview mirror, just a flicker, like something shifting in the back seat. But every time I looked, it was empty. I haven't been camping since, but sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed I still hear the whispers, faint, just on the edge of hearing, and I can't help but wonder if I left something behind in those woods, or if I brought something back with me. I had always wanted to camp alone. There's something about the idea of solitude in nature, just you and the wilderness, that had always appealed to me. No distractions, no obligations, just silence and space to think. So, when I finally had a free weekend, I packed my gear and headed deep into the mountains for a solo camping trip. I found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal clear stream running nearby. There was no one for miles, and the closest town was nearly 2 hours away by car. It was exactly what I wanted, just me, the woods, and the stars. Setting up camp was easy enough, and by the time I had pitched my tent and gathered some firewood, the sun was starting to set. The temperature dropped fast as the last light of day disappeared behind the tree line, but the fire I built was warm, crackling softly as I sat beside it with a cup of coffee. I leaned back in my camping chair, letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. But that's the thing, I didn't hear much. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual chorus of forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, was absent. Just the occasional breeze through the trees and the steady murmur of the stream nearby. At first, it didn't bother me. I figured the quiet was part of the remote beauty of the place. But as the night wore on, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. After finishing my coffee, I decided to walk down to the stream to fill my water bottle. I grabbed my flashlight and headed off into the dark. The beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating the narrow path that led from my campsite to the stream. As I walked, I noticed how unnaturally still everything was. No wind, no animals, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt. I knelt by the stream, the water cold and clear, reflecting the moonlight. I filled the bottle and was about to stand up when something caught my eye. Movement in the reflection. I froze. It was faint, but there was definitely something in the water's surface. It looked like the shape of a person standing a few yards behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness behind me. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I turned back to the water, my pulse still racing. The reflection was gone. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the sudden fear. "You're just imagining things," I whispered to myself, chalking it up to the isolation messing with my mind. I quickly made my way back to camp, feeling uneasy but trying to stay calm. Back at the fire, I forced myself to relax. It was just the forest playing tricks on me, I thought. There was nothing out there. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The shadows around the campfire seemed to stretch farther than they should, shifting and swaying in the flickering light. That's when I heard the first noise. A soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot, came from the trees just beyond the edge of my campsite. I tensed up, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam revealed nothing, just trees standing tall in the dark. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the unease clawed at my stomach. I turned off the flashlight, hoping to let the firelight bring back some comfort. It didn't. Another crack, closer this time. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tighter. The fire popped and crackled, but beyond it, the night was thick and silent again. I swept the flashlight across the tree line, my breath quickening. My heart pounded in my ears as I strained to see anything moving in the shadows. And then I saw it. 2 eyes, reflecting the light back at me from the trees, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. They were still, unblinking, watching me. My throat tightened. I couldn't move. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. They just stared, locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to call out, but my voice died in my throat. What could I even say? What was there to say? I didn't know what was out there. Maybe an animal, I told myself again. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The eyes were too high off the ground, too still, too focused. I swallowed hard and slowly backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off those glowing orbs. As I reached the flap of the tent, I fumbled for the zipper, my hands shaking. And just like that, the eyes vanished. One blink, and they were gone. I stood frozen, scanning the forest with my flashlight, but there was no trace of them. No movement, no sound, just the eerie silence of the woods pressing in on me. I hurried into the tent, zipping it up as fast as I could. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I crawled into my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, my eyes fixed on the tent's door. For hours I lay there, listening, waiting for some sign that whatever was out there had left. But I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just that same oppressive silence. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke up at dawn, the light streaming through the tent's fabric. I lay there for a moment, the events of the night before feeling distant, like a bad dream. But when I stepped outside, I knew it hadn't been a dream. The campsite was wrong. The fire pit had been disturbed, rocks overturned, ashes scattered, and my gear, which I had neatly arranged the night before, was strewn across the clearing. But the worst part was the footprints, and they weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. They were human, barefoot, leading from the edge of the forest, right up to the tent, and then back into the woods. I stared at them, my mind racing. Someone had been here, watching me, moving through my campsite while I slept. I didn't wait. I packed up my gear in a hurry, my hands trembling, my heart still pounding in my chest. Within minutes I was hiking back to the car, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sending my nerves on edge. I never looked back at the clearing. I haven't been camping since, but sometimes in the quiet moments late at night I think about those eyes, staring at me from the darkness, watching, waiting. And I wonder who, or what, was out there that night, and why they let me leave. I wasn't planning on camping alone. In fact, I had made this trip with 3 friends, but life had a way of throwing curveballs. Work emergencies, family obligations. One by one, they dropped out. I should have canceled the trip, but something about the idea of spending a few nights alone in the forest felt liberating, like I needed the quiet. So, with my gear packed and a weekend of solitude ahead, I set off. I found the perfect spot, miles from the nearest road. It was remote, even for seasoned campers. The trees here grew thicker, the branches twisted together like ancient arms reaching for each other. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and when I turned off the engine, the silence was immediate and absolute. No hum of traffic, no distant murmur of people. Just the forest and me. Setting up camp was uneventful. The tent went up easily, the fire pit built from stones I found nearby, and before I knew it, dusk was settling in. The sun dipped behind the tree line, casting long, deep shadows across the ground. I sat by the fire, eating a quick meal, enjoying the crackle of the flames. That's when I first heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a faint whisper of a sound, like the rustle of fabric. It came from behind me, somewhere deep in the trees. I turned, scanning the darkening forest, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself, a deer or a rabbit maybe. I pushed the thought aside and settled back by the fire. But it came again. This time it was closer. A soft shuffling like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. No answer, just the quiet crackling of the fire behind me. I felt a prickle of unease, but convinced myself it was nothing. I had been camping enough times to know that sounds carried weirdly in the forest. I was probably spooking myself. Night came fully, the stars blinking into view through gaps in the tree canopy. I tried to relax, but that sense of being watched crept in. The firelight flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows on the trees. It felt like the forest was shifting, rearranging itself in the darkness. I shook off the feeling and retreated to my tent. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the nylon walls of the tent providing a false sense of security. The forest outside was deathly quiet now, not even the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the oppressive silence. And then the whispering started. It was so faint at first I thought I was imagining it. A soft, almost rhythmic murmur like voices too far away to make out. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was coming from outside, moving slowly around the tent. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on and pointed it at the tent walls. The light shone through the thin fabric, illuminating the immediate area outside. But I saw nothing. No shapes, no shadows. Just the dim glow of the trees and the flickering remnants of the campfire outside. The whispering stopped. I exhaled, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just the wind, the fire, my imagination. But I wasn't convinced. Something was off. I debated whether to go outside and check, but the thought of stepping into the pitch-black forest alone was unsettling. I lay back down, gripping the flashlight tightly. The beam still pointed toward the tent walls. That's when I saw it, the silhouette. A faint, blurry outline of a figure standing just outside the tent. Not moving, just standing there. My breath caught in my throat. I sat frozen, staring at the shape, unable to move. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure was unmistakably human. Tall, motionless, its head slightly cocked to one side like it was listening. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. The figure didn't move. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, debating whether to unzip the tent and confront whatever or whoever it was. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Just gone. I blinked, convinced I had just imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but the forest outside remained quiet. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Morning came slowly, the light filtering through the trees like a promise of safety. I crawled out of the tent, exhausted but eager to leave. I packed up my gear in record time, not bothering to sit down for breakfast. The events of the night still weighed heavily on me, but I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. In the soft dirt, right outside my tent, were footprints. But they weren't like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were human, mostly, but twisted. The toes were long, almost claw-like, and the stride was unnaturally wide, like whatever had been standing there was stretching its limbs beyond what was normal. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my gear and bolted for my car, leaving the campsite behind without a second glance. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me. The forest receded in the rearview mirror, but that sense of being observed remained, clinging to me like a shadow. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about it, chalk it up to a bad experience, a weird night in the woods. But then, 2 nights ago, I woke up in my bed, heart racing, covered in sweat. And there, in the dark corner of my bedroom, I saw it again. That same figure, tall, motionless, watching me from the shadows. I flicked on the light, and it was gone. I haven't slept since, and I'm starting to realize something I should have known all along. I didn't leave the forest alone. I've always loved camping. There's something about being surrounded by nothing but trees, the crackling of a campfire, and the vast open sky that feels freeing. It's like pressing pause on life. So when my friend Jake suggested a weekend camping trip to a remote spot he'd heard about, I jumped at the chance. Just me, Jake, and our friend Liz. We were going to disconnect and enjoy nature. The drive to the campsite was long, winding through narrow roads that cut deep into the forest. We passed through a couple of small towns that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. sleepy, quiet, and a little eerie in their own way. But by the time we reached the spot, I was too excited to care. The air was fresh, the trees were towering, and there wasn't a soul around for miles. Just perfect. We set up camp in a clearing by a small glassy lake. The stillness of the water made it feel almost surreal, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As the day wore on, we hiked, fished, and relaxed, soaking in the quiet beauty of the place. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds, the hooting of owls, the distant howls of coyotes, and the constant rustling of the trees in the wind. We built a fire, ate dinner, and sat around telling stories, the flames casting dancing shadows across the campsite. That's when the first strange thing happened. It started with a voice. Faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, closer this time. A woman's voice, distant but clear, calling out, "Help. Me." Liz and Jake heard it too. We all fell silent, listening. "Help. Please." The voice was coming from deep in the woods, from the direction we hadn't explored yet. Liz looked uneasy, her eyes wide as she glanced at Jake and me. "Do you think someone's lost?" she asked. Jake shrugged, trying to play it cool, but I could tell he was unnerved too. "Maybe. Could be a hiker." I stood up, feeling an uneasy sense of responsibility. "We should check it out." Reluctantly, Jake grabbed a flashlight, and the three of us headed into the trees, the beam of light cutting through the dense darkness. The voice came again, guiding us deeper and deeper into the forest. "Help. Over here." It was getting louder, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like someone panicked or in pain. The voice was flat, emotionless, almost mechanical. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't say anything. I kept telling myself someone needed help, that we couldn't just leave them out here. After walking for what felt like too long, we reached a small clearing. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. But there was no one there, no sign of anyone who could have been calling for help. "Weird," Jake muttered, scanning the area with his flashlight. "Maybe they moved." We stood there unsure of what to do when suddenly the voice came again, but this time it was coming from behind us. "Help me." I whipped around, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees. My heart was racing now. It was impossible. We had just come from that direction. There was no way someone could have circled around us without making a sound. Jake turned to me, his face pale in the dim light. "This isn't right, man. We should go back." Liz nodded, visibly shaken, and without another word we started back toward the camp. But as we hurried through the trees, something didn't feel right. It took me a moment to realize it, but the forest seemed wrong. The path we had taken didn't look the same. The trees were denser, their trunks twisted in ways I didn't remember, and the sounds of the forest, the owls, the rustling, were gone. All that remained was the crunch of our footsteps and the unsettling silence pressing in around us. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first I thought it was just us, but then I noticed they were out of sync, too heavy, and they were coming from behind us. I stopped dead in my tracks, and so did Liz and Jake. The footsteps stopped too, just a second later. We exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" Liz whispered. Jake nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Let's keep moving. Don't stop." We picked up the pace, almost jogging now, but the footsteps followed. Every time we sped up, they sped up. Every time we slowed down, they slowed down. It was like something was matching our pace, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows between the trees. Panic set in. We were practically running now, dodging low-hanging branches and tripping over roots, desperate to get back to the safety of our camp. But no matter how far we ran, the footsteps stayed with us. And then the voice came again. "Help me. please." This time it was right next to me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the suffocating darkness. That's when I realized something horrible. The voice. It wasn't moving. It wasn't coming from one place and then another. It was coming from everywhere. "Help me!" It echoed from all around us, overlapping like it was inside my head, like the trees themselves were whispering. We finally burst through the trees, back into our camp, gasping for breath. But the sight that greeted us froze the blood in my veins. The fire had gone out. The tent was collapsed, ripped apart, as if something had torn through it. And in the middle of the clearing, where we had been sitting just an hour ago, was a circle of footprints. Barefoot. Human. Jake shined the flashlight on them, his hand shaking. "What the hell?" But before anyone could say anything, the voice came one last time. "Help me." But this time it wasn't distant. It was coming from right behind us. I didn't turn around, I couldn't. I grabbed Liz and Jake and we ran for the car, not stopping until we were inside and speeding down the dark, winding road, leaving the campsite and whatever had been out there far behind. We never spoke about what happened after that, but to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us out of those woods. Something that still whispers in the back of my mind when I'm alone at night. And sometimes when it's quiet enough, I swear I can still hear that voice. "Help me." I've always believed that the wilderness had a life of its own. There's something ancient about the forest, like it's been watching for centuries, holding secrets in the cracks of bark and the shadows between the trees. But even knowing that, I never expected what happened that night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, me, my girlfriend Hannah, and our friend Ryan. We weren't the type to go off the grid, but we found this place online, tucked deep in the mountains, far away from the noise of civilization. The reviews called it serene and isolated. That sounded perfect at the time. Now, I wish we had stayed far away. The drive took hours, the road narrowing to a single dirt lane as we climbed higher and deeper into the forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. The air was cool, crisp, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the wind through the pines. We set up camp quickly, the three of us working together like we had done a dozen times before. There was something comforting about the routine. Pitching the tent, gathering wood for the fire, unpacking the cooler. Everything felt normal. But as the darkness settled in, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me, like I was being watched from the trees. I didn't say anything, didn't want to ruin the vibe. But it was there, lingering at the back of my mind. We sat around the campfire, chatting, laughing, drinking. The warmth of the flames made the creeping chill of the night seem distant, but there was a strange tension in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the occasional crack of a twig, seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. A little too quiet. Ryan noticed it first. "You hear that?" I glanced at him, shaking my head. "Hear what?" "That's the point. There's nothing." Hannah laughed, trying to brush it off. "It's just the woods. Sometimes it gets quiet at night." But Ryan wasn't buying it, and neither was I. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. Like something was intentionally smothering the sound, draining the life from the forest around us. It was unnerving. Still, we stayed by the fire, trying to keep the conversation going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My eyes kept drifting to the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood tall and dark, the shadows between them impossibly thick. That's when we heard it. A faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was slow, deliberate, and close. Too close. "Probably just an animal," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. But then the sound came again. This time it was louder, almost rhythmic, like footsteps. Something, was circling the camp. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it into the trees, but the beam cut through only a small slice of the dark. The rest remained black, impenetrable. "Who's out there?" Ryan called, standing up. There was no response, just more rustling. A shiver ran down my spine. Then Hannah spoke, her voice low. "Guys, look at the fire." We turned. The flames were flickering wildly, sputtering as if something was sucking the oxygen out of the air. But what caught my attention was the way the light danced across the trees, their shadows. No, they weren't shadows anymore. They were moving. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, thinking it had to be a trick of the light. But no. The dark shapes in the trees were swaying, creeping closer, bending and shifting unnaturally. They weren't just cast by the fire. They were alive, slithering through the air like they had a mind of their own. "What the hell?" Ryan whispered, backing away from the edge of the clearing. We all stood, staring, paralyzed by the sight. The darkness seemed to be seeping from the trees, coiling toward us. It wasn't just shadows. It was something else. Something wrong. The shapes weren't random. They were forming figures. Vaguely human but elongated, twisted. They moved slowly, unnaturally, almost gliding across the ground. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But as soon as I said it, the figures stopped. The rustling ceased. The fire crackled normally again. The shadows returned to being just shadows, and the air lost that heavy, suffocating feel. The sudden return to normalcy was almost worse than the creeping darkness. What just happened?" Hannah stammered, her face pale. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We gathered our stuff, tossing it back into the tent, moving as quickly as we could. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. But there was no sense to it. As we scrambled to pack up, I heard Ryan muttering under his breath, "It's watching. It's still watching." I turned to him. "What are you talking about?" He pointed at the tree line. His face was white, his eyes wide with fear. I followed his gaze, and my blood turned to ice. There, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure, tall, thin, with impossibly long arms that stretched down to the ground. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, smooth surface. It didn't move. It just stood there watching us or sensing us like it was waiting. Ryan grabbed his backpack, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. Right now." We didn't argue. We grabbed what we could and bolted for the car, not daring to look back. I could feel its presence behind us the whole time, like it was following, stalking us through the trees. We made it to the car, our breath coming in ragged gasps. As soon as the doors slammed shut, I floored the gas, speeding down the dirt road. No one said a word until we were miles away from the campsite, the forest fading into the distance. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that somehow, whatever had been watching us was still there, following, lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. And then I saw it, just a glimpse in the rearview mirror. A pale figure standing in the middle of the road, staring after us, featureless and motionless. That's when I realized the truth. The wilderness doesn't just watch, it waits. The air was still, the kind of quiet that presses in on you when you're deep in the woods, far from anyone else. The only sounds were the occasional crackle from the fire and the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. It was just me and my friend, Matt, alone in a vast stretch of wilderness that hadn't seen people in a long, long time. That's how we liked it, though. The more remote, the better. No phones, no noise, no responsibilities. Just the two of us, a couple of tents, and the stars. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. Except, I'd had this nagging feeling since we arrived. We'd hiked in all day, following a faint, barely visible trail that Matt swore he'd read about online. The trail twisted deeper into the woods, through dense thickets and towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. By the time we set up camp, the sun was already dipping behind the horizon, and a cold, creeping fog began to settle around us. It was fine during the day, but now, as night closed in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wasn't sure what it was, a sixth sense maybe, but I hadn't been able to relax since we set up camp. "You hear that?" I asked, poking the fire with a stick. The embers popped and sparked, glowing brightly in the darkness. Matt looked up from his phone, the only bit of technology he hadn't left behind, despite all his talk of unplugging. He frowned, taking out an earbud. "Hear what?" I listened. The wind had died down, leaving only an eerie, oppressive silence, the kind that makes you think you can hear things, just on the edge of your perception. "I don't know," I muttered, feeling a bit foolish. "I thought I heard something like, I don't know, movement." Matt laughed, shaking his head. "It's probably just a raccoon or something. Don't worry about it, man. We're the only ones out here. The nearest town is, 30 miles away?" That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. In fact, the thought of being so far away from anyone just made the feeling worse. I glanced around, eyes straining to see beyond the reach of the firelight. The fog had thickened, making the trees look like twisted silhouettes in the darkness. It was impossible to tell where the woods ended and the night began. The shadows seemed to shift and move, like they were alive. "I'm telling you, man, something feels off," I said, keeping my voice low. Matt shrugged. "You're just spooked. It's the woods at night. It messes with your head. Trust me, nothing's out there." He went back to his phone, but I couldn't shake the anxiety twisting in my gut. I wasn't usually jumpy, and I loved the outdoors, but something about this place felt wrong, like it didn't want us here. I stood up, the cold night air biting through my jacket. "I'm going to take a look around." Matt waved me off without looking up. "Sure, just don't get lost." The fire flickered behind me as I stepped into the darkness, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating the trees and underbrush. The woods were dense, every step crunching beneath my boots as I moved farther from camp. The further I went, the more the sounds of the fire faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of a branch. I stopped, listening. There, a rustling. Soft, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart thumped in my chest. I turned slowly, scanning the area with the flashlight. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath and was about to turn back when I saw it. Something low to the ground, just at the edge of the light. A shape. It was small, but not animal small. It looked wrong, twisted, misshapen. It moved, jerking awkwardly, too fast, like it was skittering on all fours. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Matt?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why. The thing stopped. For a moment it seemed to look right at me, though I couldn't make out any eyes or a face for that matter. Just a warped shape in the darkness, crouched low like it was ready to pounce. My skin crawled. I took a step back. It didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. I turned and bolted toward the camp, my heart pounding in my ears. The underbrush snagged at my legs as I ran, and I nearly tripped more than once. When I finally burst into the clearing, Matt was still by the fire, completely oblivious. "Matt!" I gasped, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. He looked up, eyebrows raised. "What the hell, dude?" "There's something out there," I said, my voice shaking. He stood up, glancing toward the woods. "What do you mean, like an animal?" "No," I stammered, struggling to explain what I'd seen. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't an animal. It was wrong, twisted." Matt laughed, the sound harsh and too loud in the stillness. "You're seriously freaking out over nothing." "Come on, man, I'm not making this up. I saw it." He shook his head and grabbed his flashlight. "Fine, I'll go check it out." Before I could stop him, he stomped off toward the trees. I stood by the fire, my stomach twisted in knots, watching as his light disappeared into the fog. "Matt?" I called out after a minute. Silence. A few more seconds passed, and I felt that familiar prickle of unease creeping up my spine. "Matt!" I called louder this time, stepping toward the woods. There was a rustle, a snap of a branch, and then, out of the fog, Matt appeared. I let out a breath of relief. "You see anything?" He stepped into the light of the fire, his face oddly pale, his eyes wide and glassy. "Matt?" He didn't answer. He just stood there staring at me, his head tilting ever so slightly to one side. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. "Matt." I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. The way his mouth was hanging open, slack and unnatural. His skin... It wasn't Matt's skin. It was stretched too tight, almost translucent in the firelight, like something was wearing his face. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't real. But then, without warning, Matt smiled, too wide, too forced, and in a low, guttural voice he whispered, "Found it." Before I could scream, he lunged forward, and the fire went out. I've always loved the isolation of camping, getting away from the constant hum of civilization, disappearing into the wilderness where the world feels raw and untouched. So when I heard about the perfect camping spot, deep in the woods, miles from any road, away from all trails, I couldn't resist. A buddy of mine mentioned it once in passing, said it was the most peaceful place he'd ever been. But there was a reason he never went back, though he didn't say why. At the time, I didn't press him. I should have. The hike in was long, hours of navigating through dense forest with no path to follow. By the time I found the spot, this small flat clearing surrounded by towering pines, the sun was already beginning to set. I was completely alone out there. No sounds of other campers, no distant hum of cars, just the wind in the trees and the occasional caw of a bird overhead. Perfect. I set up camp, got a small fire going, and settled in for a quiet night under the stars. As dusk gave way to night, the temperature dropped fast. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches. I sat by the fire, letting its warmth soak into my skin, listening to the crackle of the wood and the rustle of the forest. That's when I noticed it, just on the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards away, a faint light. At first, I thought it was the glow of the moon filtering through the trees, but it was too concentrated, too deliberate. A small flickering light like a lantern swaying in the breeze. I stood up, squinting into the darkness. The light moved, bobbing slightly like someone was carrying it. But that didn't make sense. There was no one else out here. I was miles from the nearest trail. The rational part of me thought it had to be another camper, maybe lost. I called out, "Hey, you need help?" No response. The light paused for a moment, then started moving again, swaying gently, drifting from tree to tree, always staying just on the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the light, but as soon as the beam hit it, the light vanished. Just gone, like it had never been there. I stood there for a moment, frozen, heart pounding. The woods were silent, too silent. I could hear my own breathing, the crackling of the fire, but nothing else, not even the wind. Suddenly the light reappeared, this time closer, much closer, maybe 20 yards away, moving slowly between the trees. It was definitely a lantern, flickering and swaying, but I couldn't see who or what was carrying it. I felt a deep, primal unease settle into my chest. Something wasn't right. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, who's out there?" Again, no answer, just the steady bobbing of the lantern as it moved closer to the edge of the clearing, just out of reach of my flashlight. I don't know why, but I didn't go after it. Every instinct told me to stay by the fire, to not step into the dark. Instead, I sat down, forcing myself to calm down, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, maybe some weird reflection or an optical illusion. But deep down, I didn't believe that. For the next few hours, I sat there watching as the lantern circled the clearing. It never came closer than 20 yards, never moved farther than 50, just circling, endlessly, like it was waiting for something. By midnight, the fire was starting to die down, and with it, my courage. The temperature had plummeted. and even with my jacket I felt a biting cold seeping into my bones. I fed the fire one last time, praying that whatever it was would just leave me alone. Then around 1 a.m. the lantern stopped, dead still. It was just on the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the trees. And for the first time I saw someone standing behind it. A figure, tall and thin, barely more than a silhouette in the dim light. They were holding the lantern, but their face was hidden in shadow. My throat tightened. I called out one last time, my voice cracking. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. They just stood there, holding the lantern, watching me. The fire crackled behind me, and in that moment the lantern light flickered and then went out. I was plunged into darkness. I spun around, grabbing my flashlight, but the batteries died the second I flicked it on. I was alone, in total blackness, the cold air biting at my skin. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I fumbled for my lighter, praying for a spark, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get a flame. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the direction where the lantern had been. They crunched through the underbrush, growing louder, closer. I backed up, stumbling over my own feet, barely able to breathe. I grabbed a branch from the dying fire, a small flame still flickering at its tip, holding it out in front of me like a pathetic weapon. But the footsteps stopped just outside the glow of the fire. And then I heard it. The faintest whisper, a voice so soft it barely rose above the crackling flames. "Come with me." I froze. Every part of my body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there trembling as the voice whispered again. "Come with me." The fire sputtered and died, plunging me into darkness again, and in that moment, I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away from that voice, from whatever had been holding that lantern. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I hit the main trail, hours later, just as the sun began to rise. I didn't look back. The thing is, when I got home, I wanted to convince myself it had all been in my head. A nightmare, maybe. But then I found something in my pack. Something I didn't put there. A lantern, old, rusted, and covered in dirt, and when I picked it up, it flickered to life, just for a moment before going dark again. The figure with the lantern wasn't just a ghostly presence in the woods. It left a mark on the narrator, leaving a physical object behind. The lantern, seemingly harmless, now connects the narrator to whatever dark force roams the forest, suggesting that the next time he hears the voice, wherever he is, he may not be able to run. The horror follows him home, showing that no one truly escapes the Lantern Man. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the thick silence of the woods. I sat there, staring into the flames, their light dancing off the trees that loomed around me like silent sentinels. The others had long since gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Something about this place felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle as if the world itself is holding its breath. We'd been hiking all day, deeper and deeper into the stretch of untouched wilderness, miles away from civilization. The remoteness was the appeal. No phones, no internet, just nature, Jake had said with that crooked grin of his. I was the last to agree to this trip. I love nature, sure, but there was something about being so isolated that felt suffocating. As the firelight flickered lower, casting jagged shadows on the trees, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and glanced over at the tents. Everyone else was sound asleep. Lucky them. My nerves wouldn't let me relax. The fire spit and crackled again, sending a spray of embers into the air. I glanced over my shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond the campsite. The woods were dense, the trees like black pillars fading into the inky void. I had the distinct sense of being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, the kind of paranoia that comes when you're out of your comfort zone. But the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I thought I heard something, a faint rustling. My head snapped toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just more trees, more darkness. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the unease that was slowly tightening around my chest. Then there was a low, distant sound, a howl. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the stillness like a warning. My heart stuttered. Wolves? No, it sounded wrong. Off somehow. It wasn't an animal I'd ever heard before, not in real life or on any documentary. There was something too human about it, a shrill edge that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but it felt small and weak against the overwhelming blackness pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was nothing, but my mind kept conjuring images of wild animals creeping closer, their eyes reflecting the firelight just out of sight. And then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, between two trees, maybe 30 feet away, something moved. I froze, flashlight trained on the spot, but whatever it was darted out of sight before I could get a good look. My breath hitched. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I stood up, the fire casting my shadow long behind me as I pointed the light toward where I'd seen it. Nothing. "Jake?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud, too thin in the oppressive quiet. "Sarah?" No response, just the crackling fire and the distant rustling of leaves. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just tired. But then, there it was again. Movement. This time closer. I could see it now. A figure just beyond the edge of the light, standing still, watching. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tall and thin, almost blending in with the trees. I took a step back toward the fire, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The flames suddenly felt too small, too weak to fend off whatever was out there. Then it moved, quick, too quick. I barely had time to blink before it was gone again, melting into the shadows like smoke. My heart was racing now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I backed up until I was standing right next to the fire, the heat searing my skin but doing nothing to ease the cold knot of fear in my gut. And then I heard it, a voice. Help. It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. It came from the darkness, from the direction the figure had vanished. "Help me," the voice said again, weak and trembling. It sounded like Sarah. My stomach twisted into knots. Was she in trouble? Lost in the woods? Had she wandered off? "Sarah?" I called out, my voice breaking. "Where are you?" No answer, just the soft, pleading cry. Help! I couldn't leave her out there. Not alone, not in the dark. I grabbed the nearest stick, plunging it into the fire until the end blazed with flame, and stepped away from the camp. My legs felt like lead as I moved toward the trees, toward the voice. The beam of my flashlight wavered as my hands shook, but I pressed forward. "Sarah?" I called again. The voice was closer now, just beyond the next cluster of trees. "Help!" I pushed through the underbrush, heart hammering in my chest, but when I reached the clearing, there was no one there. Just more trees, more shadows. And then, silence. The voice was gone. I spun around, holding the flaming stick out in front of me, but the woods were empty. That overwhelming feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before, pressing down on me like a weight. I turned to head back to camp, and that's when I saw it. Sarah. She was standing there right in front of me, pale and still, her face half hidden in shadow. Relief flooded through me. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing out here? I thought..." She stepped forward into the light, and my words died in my throat. It wasn't Sarah, not really. The thing wearing her face smiled, but the skin was wrong. Too tight, too pale, like a mask stretched over something that didn't belong. And its eyes. God, its eyes were hollow, empty pits of darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my torch. It opened its mouth too wide and spoke in a voice that no longer sounded like Sarah's. "Help me!" Before I could scream, it lunged. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at camp, the fire now nothing but embers, the tents still and quiet. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for air, the blood pounding in my ears. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, but the truth was too horrifying to accept. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anything human. As I stood there, chest heaving, I heard it again, faint, distant. "Help me." And it was coming from the tents. I'm not new to camping alone. In fact, I prefer it. There's something about being completely on your own, away from the endless noise and hum of daily life, that feels freeing. The wilderness has always been my escape, a place where I could hear myself think, where I could simply exist without distraction. But this trip was different. I found the spot after searching online for places far off the beaten path. The more remote, the better. It was a small patch of forest near a river, about a half-day's hike from the nearest trailhead. There were no other campsites nearby, no marked trails, no people. Perfect solitude. It was everything I was looking for, or so I thought. I arrived late in the afternoon after a long, grueling hike. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pine and decaying leaves. There was something a little off about the place, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees were thicker here, the underbrush dense and tangled, like the forest itself had grown wild, untouched for decades. I pitched my tent in a small clearing near the river. The water flowed gently, a soft, rhythmic sound that normally would have been soothing, but instead, it felt like it was trying to mask something. I couldn't hear any birds, no rustling in the bushes. The forest was still, too still. I forced myself to ignore it. I'd come here for peace, after all, and that's what I was going to get. By nightfall, the fire was crackling, sending sparks dancing into the air. I sat on a log staring into the flames, listening to the occasional pop of burning wood. The darkness around me felt thick, pressing in from all sides, swallowing the trees just beyond the firelight. Every now and then I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. Just shadows playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a low, distant sound barely audible over the crackling fire and the river. A faint hum, like the wind moving through the trees. Only, there was no wind. I stood up, scanning the woods with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reach far. The trees stood still, silent, their branches hanging limp. I shook my head, laughing nervously. It was nothing. Probably an animal in the distance. I'd been in the woods enough to know the kinds of sounds they make. But then a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. A hum followed by a soft whisper. My skin prickled. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the sound of someone breathing softly, just out of sight, barely there. I stood frozen for a moment, straining to hear, but the sound faded into the night, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the distant gurgle of the river. I told myself it was just the forest. Sounds travel strangely at night, especially in places as remote as this. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. Faint noises, a soft rustle, the distant hum. Several times, I thought I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves just outside my tent. But every time I opened the flap and shone my flashlight out into the dark, there was nothing there. By morning, I was exhausted, but the daylight brought some relief. The unease from the night before faded in the light of day, though a nagging feeling still tugged at the back of my mind. I decided to explore the area a bit, hoping that a long hike would clear my head. The forest was dense, the air damp and heavy. I walked along the river for a while, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But no matter how far I went, that sensation clung to me, like unseen eyes followed me through the trees. At one point I found a spot where the ground was soft, almost muddy, and there, pressed into the earth, were footprints. Bare, human footprints. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else since I arrived, and these prints were fresh. Too fresh. They were larger than mine, deep enough to suggest that whoever made them had been standing there for some time, just watching the river. I told myself it had to be an old print, maybe from a hunter or a hiker who had passed through long ago. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. There were more prints leading away from the river and disappearing into the woods, and they led straight toward my camp. A chill crawled down my spine. I turned around, scanning the forest, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. But there was nothing. Just the trees, tall and silent, their branches hanging heavy with the weight of the damp air. I hurried back to camp, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. By the time I returned, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows over the clearing. I wanted to leave. Every instinct was screaming at me to pack up and get out before night fell. But the hike back to the trailhead was long, and I wasn't sure I'd make it before dark. That night, the forest seemed to close in around me. The fire felt smaller, the darkness heavier, and the noises. They were closer now. I could hear them just beyond the circle of light, soft whispers, barely more than breaths, as if someone was standing just outside the firelight, speaking in hushed tones. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the clearing, circling me. I stood up, clutching the flashlight in one hand, a knife in the other. My heart pounded in my ears as I swept the beam across the trees, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing, no one, but I knew. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it sounded like they were right behind me. I spun around, shining the light frantically into the dark, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. Tall, thin, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I froze. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there staring at the thing, my breath caught in my throat. Then slowly it stepped back into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and ran. I left the fire burning, the tent still standing, and ran through the dark, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to get away from that thing, from whatever it was that had been watching me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my chest burning, legs trembling. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me, that it's still out there, watching, waiting. I always loved camping. Something about the fresh mountain air, the crackling of the campfire, and the isolation from the busy world always gave me peace. This time was no different. It was a late fall weekend, and my friends, Matt and Sarah, had convinced me to camp out at a secluded spot they found a few hours outside of town. We arrived just before dusk, the sun casting long, eerie shadows between the towering pines. The campsite was far from any main roads, no cell signal, no one around for miles. Perfect, I thought. Just us, the stars, and a weekend of relaxation. The first few hours were blissful. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and joked around as the flames flickered high into the night sky. As the evening deepened, an unsettling chill settled over the woods. It wasn't the cold that got to me, though. It was the quiet, too quiet. No wind rustling through the trees, no insects buzzing, no nocturnal animals stirring. Just silence. After dinner, Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, heading into the woods with her flashlight. Matt and I stayed behind, poking at the fire in comfortable silence. Minutes passed, then more minutes. We figured she might be taking her time, so we didn't think much of it. Until I heard the voice. It was faint, like a whisper carried on a breeze, but there was no breeze. "Help me." I froze, glancing at Matt, but he didn't seem to hear it. I shook it off. Maybe I was imagining things. But then I heard it again, this time louder, more desperate. "Help me!" I shot up, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Matt asked, looking confused. The voice, it sounded like Sarah. Matt frowned. "Sarah, she's just—" He trailed off, glancing toward the trees. "She's been gone a while, hasn't she?" We both grabbed our flashlights and called out for her. "Sarah? Hey, Sarah? You good?" No response. The woods, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien, darker, like they were closing in on us. We ventured in the direction she went, flashlights cutting through the thick trees, calling her name louder now. Still nothing. After what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, we found her flashlight lying on the ground, flickering weakly. No sign of Sarah. "Sarah!" I yelled, panic rising in my chest. "Sarah, where are you?" Suddenly, Matt tensed beside me, his face going pale. He grabbed my arm, squeezing hard. "Dude, look." I followed his gaze. There, not more than 30 feet away, was Sarah, or at least what looked like Sarah. She was standing perfectly still, facing away from us, her head tilted slightly, like she was listening to something. Relief washed over me. "Sarah!" I called out, running toward her. Matt's grip tightened, pulling me back. "No, wait." I stopped, confused. "What? Why?" "Something's wrong," Matt muttered, his voice shaking. I turned back toward Sarah, or whatever that was. She hadn't moved, not even a twitch. The way she stood, so unnaturally still, her hair hanging limply around her face, was wrong. "Sarah?" I called out again, my voice faltering this time. Then she moved, jerkily, like a puppet whose strings had just been pulled. She turned her head, but not all the way, just enough for me to see the side of her face, her eyes empty, wide, like she wasn't seeing me at all. And then, without a sound, she stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the trees. We stood frozen, fear wrapping around us like a vice. "That wasn't Sarah," Matt whispered, barely audible. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. We retreated back to the camp, both of us shaken. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was playing some kind of prank. Maybe we were just tired, seeing things. But the unease gnawed at me. Back at the camp, the fire had died down to embers. We sat in silence, waiting for something, anything. I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see her step back into the clearing. Hours passed. Still no Sarah. Around 2 a.m., Matt suddenly stiffened beside me. "Do you hear that?" I strained to listen, and then I heard it, a faint, distant voice. But this time, it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was mine. "Help me." I felt my blood run cold. It was my voice calling out from the woods. Before I could react, we heard footsteps approaching the campsite. Slow, deliberate. Matt and I shot to our feet, shining our flashlights toward the sound. Sarah emerged from the trees, looking normal. Too normal, like nothing had happened. She smiled at us, her eyes too bright, her expression too calm. "Where were you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "Just needed some air," she said, her voice casual. "What's wrong? You guys look like you've seen a ghost." Matt and I exchanged a glance. Something was of. We both knew it. But what could we do? This was Sarah. At least it looked like her. We didn't ask any more questions, just sat back down by the fire, pretending everything was fine. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Sarah eventually went to her tent, leaving Matt and me alone. Neither of us slept. By morning, I decided we needed to leave. But when we went to wake Sarah, her tent was empty. Completely empty. No sleeping bag, no clothes, no trace she had ever been there. Matt and I searched the entire campsite, the woods everywhere. There was no sign of her. It was like she had vanished. As we packed up to leave, I glanced down at my phone. Still no signal. but there was something on the screen that wasn't there before. A single notification, a voice message from Sarah's number. With shaking hands, I played it. It was static at first, then her voice, faint and terrified. "Help me, please. They're here. They're not me." The message cut out. We never found Sarah. We reported her missing, but nothing ever came of it. Matt and I tried to move on, but something followed us back from those woods. I hear her voice sometimes, calling my name, just outside my window in my own voice. And sometimes late at night I see her, or what looks like her, standing at the edge of the woods, just staring, waiting. I still can't shake the memories of that night. No matter how much time passes, I find myself thinking about it whenever the sun starts to set. And I'll tell you this, I've never gone camping again. It was me, my girlfriend Jenna, and our friend couple, Tom and Rachel. We were all outdoorsy types, the kind of people who love to hike all day and sleep under the stars. We'd done it 1,000,000 times, but this time we chose a spot that was off the grid, a place called Devil's Bluff. The name should have been a warning, but we thought it sounded cool, like a challenge. It was a secluded spot deep in the forest, and barely anyone knew about it, which meant no crowds, no noise, just us and nature. We drove up the winding dirt road that led into the forest, parked the car, and hiked for a couple of hours to reach the bluff. It was everything we wanted. Tall, ancient trees, a gorgeous view of the valley below, and complete silence. We set up camp just as the sun was beginning to set, the golden light filtering through the trees. It was peaceful, perfect even. After setting up the tents and getting a fire going, we settled in for the night. The moon was full, bright enough that it cast eerie shadows through the trees. Rachel was the first to notice something strange. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice quiet. We all stopped talking and listened. At first I didn't hear anything, just the usual sounds of the woods, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. But then I caught it. A faint sound, almost like crying. It was soft, distant, barely there, but unmistakable. "Maybe someone's out there," Tom said, glancing toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "Could be another camper." I laughed, trying to brush it off. "In this place? We're the only ones dumb enough to hike all the way out here." But the crying didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, like whoever, or whatever, was making it was getting closer. Jenna frowned, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It sounds like a child." That's when things got weird. Rachel stood up suddenly, shining her flashlight toward the woods. "Hello?" she called out, her voice hesitant. There was no response. Just that soft, persistent crying, drifting on the night air. We all stared into the darkness, our hearts pounding. The fire seemed dimmer, like the light wasn't reaching as far as it should have. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, deeply wrong. "Maybe it's an animal," Tom suggested, but his voice didn't have any conviction behind it. Jenna shook her head. "No, that's a kid, a little girl, I think." We stood there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The crying would stop for a few seconds, then pick up again, closer each time. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Tom was the one to make the move. "We can't just leave her out there," he said. "I'm going to check it out." Before we could argue, he grabbed his flashlight and started walking toward the sound, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. Rachel followed right behind him, and after a moment, Jenna and I joined them. We didn't want to leave anyone alone, not in a place like this with that sound hanging in the air. We walked deeper into the woods, the crying leading us forward. The farther we went, the more it felt like the trees were closing in, the shadows growing longer, darker. That's when I realized something chilling. We had walked a good distance away from our campfire, but the crying hadn't gotten any closer. In fact, it sounded like it was coming from all around us, surrounding us. Jenna stopped in her tracks and grabbed my arm. "This doesn't make any sense," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tom, who was a few feet ahead, suddenly stopped too. his flashlight aimed at something in the distance. "Do you see that?" We all looked, squinting through the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I saw it, just beyond the trees where the moonlight barely reached. There was a figure, small, pale, standing perfectly still. It was a little girl. Her head was bowed, her long hair falling over her face, and her arms hung limply at her sides. She wore a white dress, torn and dirty, and she was barefoot. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just standing there, motionless, like she'd been waiting for us. Rachel gasped, stepping back. "Oh my God." "Hey," Tom called out, moving toward her. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't respond, didn't even move. She just stood there, her head down, as though she hadn't heard him. The whole situation felt like a dream, a nightmare, actually. I wanted to grab Tom, pull him back, tell him not to get any closer, but my feet wouldn't move. "Something's wrong," Jenna whispered, her nails digging into my arm. "We need to leave." Before I could say anything, Tom took another step toward the girl, and that's when she lifted her head. Slowly, unnaturally. Her face, it wasn't right. Her eyes were wide and dark, too dark, like they were just empty pits. Her mouth twisted into a smile, a horrible crooked smile that spread too far across her face. And then she started walking toward us. No, not walking. She glided. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She moved silently, quickly, that twisted smile still stretching across her face. "Run!" I shouted, finally finding my voice. We turned and bolted back toward the camp, crashing through the trees, our flashlights bouncing wildly. Behind us, I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, like she was right on our heels, chasing us through the forest. We didn't stop until we reached the fire, panting and terrified. When we looked back, there was no sign of her, no footsteps, no rustling. Just the trees, standing still in the moonlight, like nothing had happened. "Pack up," I gasped, grabbing my stuff. "We're leaving. Now." None of us argued. We frantically packed our gear, our hands shaking, the fear clinging to us like the night air. The crying had stopped completely, but in the silence, something else had started. A whisper. Faint, like it was drifting on the wind, calling us back. We left everything that didn't fit in our bags and hiked out as fast as we could. No one said a word the entire time. When we finally reached the car and peeled out of the forest, I didn't feel safe until we were miles away, driving back toward town. Here's the part that still gets me, though, the part that keeps me up at night. When we got home and collapsed on the couch, I pulled out my phone to check the photos I'd taken earlier in the day, back at the campsite. Most of them were just us setting up, laughing, having a good time. But in one of the pictures, just behind Tom and Rachel, standing at the edge of the trees, was the girl. The same girl, pale, dirty, wearing that same torn white dress. She was watching us the whole time. I had always been the kind of person who loved solitude. Camping alone gave me the clarity I needed, away from the rush of daily life. That's why last summer, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the Rocky Mountains. Not a campground, not even a marked trail, just a remote spot I'd heard about from some old hiking blogs. It promised the kind of isolation I craved. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wild. The place was called Bitterroot Valley, an area so far off the beaten path that you wouldn't find it on any tourist map. That alone was enough to intrigue me. The journey took a full day of hiking through dense forest, the trail growing more obscure as I pushed deeper into the wilderness. By the time I arrived at the clearing, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. The place was perfect, surrounded by towering pines, a small, crystal-clear lake, and nothing but wilderness for miles. I set up camp near the edge of the lake, with the water calm and still, reflecting the darkening sky. It was quiet that night. Too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, no insects chirping. Just silence. At first I relished it. I thought maybe it was just the remoteness of the place, But after I set up my tent and sat by the fire, I noticed something was off. The lake, the trees, everything around me felt still, unnaturally so, like the world was holding its breath. It wasn't until I started hearing the whispers that I realized how wrong I was about this place. It started subtle, just a faint murmuring like wind slipping through cracks in a door, but there was no wind that night. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, a trick of the mind when it's too quiet. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. Words. Soft, unintelligible words. I told myself it was just the sound of the lake, or maybe the trees shifting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. After a while, the whispers seemed to fade, and I figured I was just overtired from the hike. I tossed a few more logs on the fire and settled in for the night. Laying in my sleeping bag, I closed my eyes, letting the crackling of the fire outside lull me to sleep. Then I woke up to something strange. The fire was still going, but it cast long, uneven shadows on the outside of my tent, shadows that moved. At first I thought it might be the branches swaying, but then I remembered there was no wind. The trees had been completely still all night. Slowly I reached for my flashlight, and as I clicked it on, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate. Like someone was walking around the perimeter of my tent, circling it. My heart raced, but I didn't move. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped and started, pausing for a few seconds before continuing. Whoever it was, whatever it was, wasn't in a hurry. I sat up quietly, trying not to make a sound as I unzipped the tent just a crack, enough to peer outside with my flashlight. But when I shone the beam around the clearing, there was no one there. Just the empty clearing, the calm lake, and my campfire burning steadily. I was about to close the tent again, thinking maybe I had imagined it, when something caught my eye. On the far side of the lake, just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was faint, barely more than a silhouette in the darkness. But it was there, standing motionless, watching me. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs and a distorted posture. It didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly cocked, as if it were studying me. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. My brain struggled to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a tree, or a trick of the light. But no matter how hard I blinked or focused, the figure remained. I watched it for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. And then, without warning, it disappeared. Not like it walked away, just vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the night. I backed into the tent, zipping it up quickly. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen, for those footsteps to return or the figure to reappear. But nothing did. The next morning I convinced myself that it had been some kind of waking dream, that I was just exhausted, and my mind had conjured up something out of the darkness. I packed up my gear, eager to leave that place behind. I was done. Whatever peace I had come here to find wasn't worth the growing dread that clung to me. But here's where things took a turn for the worse. As I began hiking back, retracing my steps, I noticed something strange along the trail. The trees. They looked different. The deeper I went, the more twisted and gnarled they became, as if they had been warped by something. I didn't remember them being like this on the way in. Then, halfway through the hike back, I found it, a single small clearing in the woods. In the center of that clearing, there was a ring of stones perfectly arranged in a circle. But that wasn't the worst part. In the middle of the stone circle was a tent. My tent. At first I thought I had somehow gotten turned around, but that didn't make sense. I had been hiking in a straight line, following the map and GPS, and yet there it was. My campsite, exactly as I had left it. The same fire pit, the same clearing, even the same tracks I'd made the night before. It was impossible. I circled the clearing, panic setting in. How could this be? I had left hours ago, hiked miles away, and yet I was back. Or maybe I had never left. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, but not mine. These were larger, deeper, and there were many of them, all leading in and out of my camp, as if a group of people had been circling it while I slept. The ground was disturbed, and as I looked closer I saw something else. Handprints. Dozens of them pressed into the dirt, like someone or something had crawled its way around my tent during the night. My chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my pack, not caring about what I left behind, and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I reached the car, threw my gear inside, and sped out of those woods, never looking back. It's been months since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the memory of that figure and those footprints, they haunt me. Sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear the soft sound of footsteps circling me, slow and deliberate. And in the silence just beyond the reach of the light, I can almost hear the faintest whisper. I've always liked camping alone. There's something peaceful about being completely cut off from the world, away from the noise, the people, and the clutter of modern life. Just you, the trees, and the sound of your own breath. So when I got a rare weekend off from work, I decided to head out to a spot I'd never been before. An isolated patch of forest about 2 hours from town. No cell service, no nearby campsites, just miles of trees and quiet. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, and a book. I wasn't planning on doing much more than sitting by the fire and listening to the wind. The trail wasn't marked on any map I'd seen, but I'd heard about it from an old hiker I met on a previous trip. He called it Dead Man's Hollow. A strange name, sure, but it was just a name. He had warned me it could be a little rough out there, but I wasn't worried. I'd been camping alone for years. The drive was uneventful, the hike even more so. I found the spot pretty easily, a small clearing beside a stream, surrounded by tall pines that blotted out most of the sunlight. Perfect. I set up camp quickly and spent the afternoon gathering firewood and exploring the area a little. There wasn't much to see, just more trees, the occasional animal track, and the slow-moving water of the creek. As the sun started to set, I lit a fire and cooked a simple dinner. By the time the stars came out, I was already feeling relaxed. The night was cool, and the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows through the trees. I sat there for a long time just staring at the flames, letting the quiet sink in. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. It wasn't an immediate feeling, more like a subtle shift. The sounds of the forest, crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, they all seemed to stop. 1 second, the night was alive with the typical noises of the woods, and the next, there was nothing. Complete silence. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. I sat up, suddenly on edge. My flashlight was beside me, so I grabbed it and shined it into the darkness. The trees looked normal, their long shadows stretching toward the campfire, but something about the air felt heavy. I couldn't explain it. It was like I was being watched, though I knew that was impossible. "Hello?" I called out, half expecting to hear nothing but my own voice bouncing off the trees. But there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic for that. It was a faint humming, low and drawn out, almost like someone was humming a lullaby off in the distance. I stood up, shining my light toward the source of the sound. It was coming from deeper in the woods, past the creek, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows swallowed up the light. The sound was getting louder, more distinct, and the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The humming stopped. Just like that. And in its place, there was only silence again. My pulse quickened as I scanned the tree line, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I was no stranger to weird sounds in the woods, but this felt different. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone, and being alone in the dark can do funny things to your head. I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, but my body was tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. About an hour passed, and the silence persisted. I tried to distract myself with my book, but I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire to die down to embers. The forest stayed quiet as I zipped up the tent and settled into my sleeping bag. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up suddenly, heart racing, my skin cold with sweat. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay there, frozen, listening. That's when I heard it again. The humming. Only now it was closer, much closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was coming from right outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, like someone was standing there just inches from the fabric, humming softly. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. My flashlight was still next to me, so I grabbed it and switched it on, the beam shaking as I aimed it toward the tent flap. The humming stopped the moment the light clicked on. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, terrified of what might happen next, but everything was still. I had two options: stay in the tent, pretending I hadn't heard anything, or step outside and face whatever, or whoever, was out there. Every instinct in my body told me to stay put, but something compelled me to move. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was stupidity, but I had to know. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped out into the cold night air, flashlight in hand. The fire was nothing more than a few glowing embers now, casting faint light on the ground. I swept the beam across the campsite. Nothing. Just the trees, the creek, and the silence. I turned in a slow circle, my heart still racing. There was no one there, no animals, no people, just me in the cold, still night. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I must have imagined it. Maybe it was just a dream. But then I saw them, footprints, in the dirt just outside the tent, fresh, unmistakable footprints. Bare feet, no shoes, leading from the creek to where I was standing. My blood ran cold. I followed the prints with my flashlight, and they led right to the spot where I had been sleeping, stopping just inches from the tent flap. The dirt there was disturbed, like something had stood there watching me, humming softly before vanishing into the woods. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my stuff, shoved it into my pack as fast as I could, and left everything I didn't need behind. I didn't care that it was still the middle of the night. I just needed to get out of those woods, back to the car, back to anywhere with light, with people. I hiked the whole way back, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, every crunch of a leaf underfoot sending chills down my spine. I kept expecting to hear that humming again, but I didn't. The forest remained eerily quiet, all the way back to the car. By the time I made it to the parking lot, dawn was just starting to break. The pale light of the morning didn't make me feel any safer. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but one thing's for sure. I'm done camping alone. I'd always heard stories about the Watcher's Wood, but I never took them seriously. It was one of those places that locals loved to talk about, a dense patch of forest where strange things supposedly happened. There were tales of people hearing voices, seeing figures in the trees, and of campers who never made it back out. But you know how it is? Those stories always felt exaggerated, told to scare the younger crowd or keep thrill seekers away. I'm not easily scared, and I liked a good adventure. So, when I finally got some time off, I figured I'd head out there and see what all the fuss was about. I'd camped alone plenty of times, and the thought of spending a couple of nights in the infamous Watcher's Wood intrigued me more than it scared me. I packed light, tent, a good amount of food, a flashlight, and my journal. I drove out to the edge of the forest and hiked in. It wasn't on any official trail, but I had a general idea of where to go. thanks to some old maps I'd found online. As I got deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, their branches twisting overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. By the time I reached the clearing I'd picked as my campsite, it was late afternoon, and the place was dead quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I brushed off the unease in my gut, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I set up my tent by a small creek, the only sound coming from the water trickling over the rocks. It felt peaceful at first, the kind of peace that comes with being completely cut off from the world. As night fell, the quiet became oppressive. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every small noise you make. The wind barely moved through the trees, and the stars overhead seemed faint, like they didn't want to witness what might come. I lit a fire, hoping it would ease the tension, and I started cooking some dinner. That's when I heard it. The first sign that something wasn't right. A soft rustling in the trees. At first I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't the scurrying of something small. It was slow, measured, like footsteps. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Hello? Anyone out there? Nothing. The beam of light only showed trees and underbrush, shadows dancing as the fire flickered behind me. I scanned the woods for a few more moments before sitting back down, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, nothing to worry about. People camped here all the time, right? But the uneasy feeling only grew. As I sat by the fire, I started hearing something else. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but there was no wind. It was a voice, low and distant, coming from deep within the forest. I strained to listen. It was a woman's voice, or at least it sounded like one, but I couldn't make out the words. They were garbled, distorted, almost like they were being whispered underwater. My skin prickled as the voice grew louder, still unintelligible but undeniably there. It sounded like it was calling out, searching for someone, or something. I grabbed my flashlight again, shining it into the dark. Who's there? The voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse than the voice. My heart was pounding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the forest for any movement, but saw nothing. Just the tall, looming trees casting long, eerie shadows. I sat back down by the fire, my nerves on edge. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was getting to me more than I thought. I was alone out here after all. It's easy to hear things that aren't there when you're alone. But that was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, and not mine. Fresh ones. They were in the soft dirt just outside the circle of light from my fire. I hadn't noticed them before, but there they were, leading from the edge of the forest to the spot where I had been sitting. Bare footprints, like someone had walked right up behind me, stopped, and then vanished. My throat went dry and I felt my pulse quicken. Someone, something, had been there, just moments ago, standing right behind me, watching. I backed up toward the tent, grabbing my pack and pulling out the small hatchet I always carried with me. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing again, but there was nothing, no one. Just the dark, silent forest, staring back at me. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the hike out would take hours, and it was pitch black. I wasn't about to navigate the dense woods at night, with whatever was out there lurking in the trees. So I did the next best thing. I stoked the fire, kept my flashlight close, and sat there waiting, listening. For a long time nothing happened, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched never left. Every now and then, I'd hear the faintest shuffle of leaves or a soft footstep just beyond the reach of the firelight. Around midnight, the voice returned. It was clearer now, louder, as if whoever or whatever was speaking had moved closer. This time I could make out the words. It was a woman's voice, soft but insistent. Help me." The word sent a chill down my spine. I stood up again, gripping the hatchet tight, my flashlight flicking from tree to tree. "Who's there? Where are you?" No answer. Just silence, thick and suffocating. But I could feel it now. Eyes watching me from the dark, just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew it wasn't human. No person moves that quietly. No person leaves footprints without a trace, and no person just disappears. I stayed up the entire night, sitting by the fire, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't sleep, didn't blink, just listened to the occasional shuffle of movement in the trees and the faint, distant voice calling for help. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up what I could, threw the rest of my gear into the tent, and hiked out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I made it back to the car. When I got home, I tried to tell myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the isolation had gotten to me, or that the stories about Watcher's Wood had planted something in my mind. But a week later, I pulled out my pack to clean it, and I found something that still makes my skin crawl. A single, long strand of dark hair, twisted, tangled, and knotted around the strap of my backpack. I don't have dark hair. I don't know anyone who does. And I've never been back to Watcher's Wood. I don't plan to. I always loved the outdoors. There was something about the wilderness that felt honest, just you, nature, and the quiet hum of life beyond the buzzing cities. So when I found an isolated camping spot deep in the woods, far from the usual beaten trails, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It took me hours to hike there. The forest thickened, and by the time I arrived, the trees seemed almost alive, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. It was perfect. No other campers, no noise, just pure solitude. I set up my tent near a clearing close to a small creek, the babbling water offering some comfort. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees, so I quickly gathered some firewood before the forest swallowed the light completely. As night fell, the air turned cool. The crackle of the fire kept me warm, but that first hint of unease settled in my gut. It wasn't anything specific, just the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, blaming it on the isolation. It had been months since I'd been anywhere this remote, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Around midnight, just as I was dozing off in my tent, I heard it, a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up listening, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. It could have been a deer or a raccoon. I told myself that as I strained to hear over the pounding of my own heart. But there it was again, a faint crunching of leaves like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped out, trying to control my breathing, sweeping the light back and forth. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. The sound of my voice echoed through the forest, but there was no response. I stood there for what felt like hours just listening, but the forest was silent, unnaturally so. No insects, no wind, nothing, just the quiet press of the night. Reluctantly, I crawled back into my tent, convincing myself that whatever it was, it had gone. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every shift of the wind sent a new wave of paranoia through me. At some point I drifted off, but I woke to the feeling of being suffocated, a heavy pressure on my chest. My eyes shot open, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed, but my body was paralyzed. In the dim light of the dying fire, I saw something or someone standing at the entrance of my tent. A tall, shadowy figure, its head cocked slightly, as if observing me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it came, the pressure lifted and I gasped for air, sitting up and frantically shining my flashlight in every direction. The figure was gone. The forest was silent, save for the crackling remnants of the fire. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure didn't return. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. This place didn't feel right anymore. I packed my gear and started the long hike back, but the trail felt different. The trees, once inviting, now seemed to close in on me. The forest felt like it was breathing, alive with something unseen. I quickened my pace, heart racing, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that clung to me. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail was wrong. I'd been following it for hours, but instead of leading me back to the main road, it looped around. I found myself back at the same clearing where I'd camped the night before. My stomach dropped. I hadn't taken a wrong turn. I knew these woods. But somehow I was right back where I started. The fire pit I'd built was still smoldering, and my footprints from the morning were fresh in the dirt. Panicked, I grabbed my map, but it was useless. The landmarks didn't match. The trees twisted into shapes that didn't belong, and no matter which direction I walked, I kept ending up in the same place. I spent the entire day trying to escape, but the forest wouldn't let me go. By the time the sun began to set again, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and desperate. The shadows lengthened, and with them came that familiar sense of being watched. As night fell once more, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I knew, deep down, that the figure from last night would return. And it did. I saw it standing just beyond the firelight, tall and impossibly still. But this time, there were more of them. 3, maybe 4, each standing in the shadows watching me. I screamed, throwing rocks and shouting, but they didn't move. They just stood there watching, waiting. That's when I realized I wasn't lost. I was never lost. They had brought me here. They wanted me here. As the figures slowly stepped into the light, their faces, or what should have been faces, were wrong. They were twisted, featureless, as if someone had erased their identities. And that's when the truth hit me, hard and cold. They weren't watching me. They were waiting for me to join them. The fire flickered, and in that moment I knew there was no leaving this forest. I was already a part of it. I've always thought of camping as a way to escape, a way to recharge and forget about life for a while. But what I didn't expect was that my last trip would make me question reality itself. A few months ago, I decided to head out to a remote section of the Catskills. It was a spot that a friend had told me about, far off the beaten path, where you could camp by a pristine lake surrounded by dense forest. It sounded perfect. I needed the time alone, away from work, away from people. I packed my gear, drove out to the trailhead, and started the 5-mile hike to the lake. When I arrived, the place was everything I had imagined. Beautiful, untouched, peaceful. The lake's surface was so still it reflected the sky perfectly, like a mirror. I was the only one there. No other hikers, no signs of anyone having been there in months. That's exactly how I wanted it. I set up my tent just a few feet from the shore and spent the evening relaxing by the water. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lake, I built a fire, cooked a small meal, and settled in for the night. That's when things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was the reflection in the lake. I was sitting by the fire, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught my own reflection on the water's surface. Only, something was wrong. My reflection was sitting there just like me, but it didn't match my movements exactly. When I leaned forward to poke at the fire, it hesitated, like it was mimicking me, but with a slight delay. I stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out if it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but the longer I watched, the more obvious it became. My reflection was moving, but it wasn't in sync with me. And then it smiled. I wasn't smiling, my blood ran cold. I stood up, and so did my reflection. Again, a split second too late. The smile didn't leave its face, stretching wider than it should have. I backed away from the water, my heart racing. The reflection followed, still smiling, its eyes fixed on mine. I looked behind me, expecting to see someone, something, on the shore of the lake. But there was nothing there, just me and the darkening woods. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a weird trick of the light, maybe the ripples on the water distorting the image. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned away from the lake, determined to focus on the fire to push the strange occurrence out of my mind. But then I heard a splash. It was soft, barely audible, but enough to make me turn around. There, in the middle of the lake, was something moving. The water rippled outward, slow and deliberate, as if something was gliding just beneath the surface. I squinted, trying to see what it was, but the fading light made it hard to make out any details. Whatever it was coming closer. The water lapped at the shore as the thing, whatever it was, moved toward me. And then it stopped, just a few feet from the edge of the lake, its shape hidden beneath the still surface. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the water. For a moment I saw nothing but my reflection again, still smiling, still wrong. But then, just beneath my reflection, something else appeared. A face. Pale, almost translucent with hollow sunken eyes. It stared up at me from the depths of the lake, its mouth opening slowly into a wide, unnatural grin, just like my reflection had. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The face in the water didn't move. It just kept staring, unblinking, the grin widening until it looked like the skin around its mouth might tear. I ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear. I don't remember packing anything. All I know is that I sprinted back through the woods, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I tore down the trail. I could hear splashes behind me, soft at first, but growing louder, faster. Something was following me. The whole time I kept glancing back, expecting to see the face, the thing from the lake. But I didn't. What I saw instead was something worse. It was me. Running through the trees behind me was me. Or at least it looked like me. But it wasn't right. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its face was twisted into that same horrible grin I had seen in the water. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The thing that looked like me was getting closer, its footsteps growing louder, faster, but still wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and floored it. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, I caught one last glimpse of it standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. It was still smiling. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was well out of the forest. By the time I reached the nearest town, the sun was rising, and I was shaking so badly I could barely keep my hands on the wheel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe that my reflection came to life, that something was chasing me through the woods, wearing my face? But now every time I look in the mirror, I can't shake the feeling that something is off. Just a little. My reflection is always a beat too slow, and sometimes when I turn away, I swear I see it, smiling. I always thought I was a seasoned camper. I'd been in the woods more times than I could count, both alone and with friends, and the idea of nature didn't scare me. In fact, it was where I went to clear my mind. But that all changed after last summer. It was supposed to be a quick solo weekend trip. I had found a secluded spot about 10 miles off any trail in a national forest that stretched for hundreds of miles. No campsites, no tourists, just pure wilderness. I wanted the isolation, the quiet. I wanted to escape from the noise of the city and all the stress that came with it. The first day was uneventful. I hiked most of the afternoon, found a nice clearing near a small stream, and set up camp. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to enjoy the stillness. No cars, no voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I had wanted. Around 10 p.m. I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire burning low outside, just enough light to keep the darkness at bay. I fell asleep almost immediately, the exhaustion from the hike catching up with me. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The woods were quiet, and the fire had long since died out. My small tent felt stifling, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I thought maybe it was a sound that had woken me, something out of place. And then I heard it again, a faint distant sound, not the usual rustling of animals, not the wind through the trees. It was singing, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was the kind of melody you'd hear on an old record, slow and haunting, and it sent a chill down my spine. I lay there, completely still, straining to listen, convinced that I was imagining it. But no, it was real. It was faint, but getting closer. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe there were other campers nearby, but I knew that wasn't possible. I had hiked deep into the forest, far from any marked trails. I hadn't seen another person all day. The singing grew louder, though it remained eerie and soft, as if carried on the breeze. I unzipped my tent just a little and peeked out. The clearing was empty. No fire, no light. Nothing but the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. The singing stopped. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I had heard. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard something new. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned off my flashlight. I didn't want to be seen. The footsteps were heavy, crunching over dried leaves and sticks. They paused every few steps, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was listening, waiting for something. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind screaming at me to do something, to run, but I couldn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the edge of the clearing, expecting to see someone or something step out of the darkness. But no one did. Instead, the footsteps stopped and the singing resumed, louder this time, closer. It was the same eerie, haunting melody, but now it felt like it was all around me, echoing through the trees. I don't know how long I sat there listening, too terrified to move, but eventually, the singing began to fade again, retreating into the woods. The footsteps resumed briefly before disappearing entirely. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, clutching my flashlight and knife, listening to the forest for any sign of the singing or footsteps returning. But the rest of the night passed without incident. At first light, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. My body was stiff from fear and lack of sleep, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, the memory of the singing played over and over in my mind. It was haunting, familiar, like something from a dream, and it left a knot of unease in my stomach. About halfway back, I noticed something strange. The trees looked different. Not in the way that nature changes as you move through the forest, but wrong. At first I couldn't figure out why, but then I realized the trees around me were scarred. Deep gouges in the bark, long and jagged, as if something had been dragging its claws through them. I stopped, heart racing again, and looked closer. The marks were fresh. Some of them had bits of bark hanging loose, the wounds still raw. They followed a path leading deeper into the woods, away from my route. I didn't follow them. I kept walking, faster now, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, safe, surrounded by the comforting sounds of the parking lot. That was the last time I went camping alone. Whatever I heard in those woods, whatever left those marks in the trees, it wasn't human. And it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I've always loved camping. There's something about the silence of the woods that calms me, the crackling fire under the stars, the crisp air biting at my skin. But what happened last fall made me rethink everything. It was late October when I decided to head out for a solo trip. There's a spot I'd been eyeing for a while, about a 2-hour hike into the forest, far off the usual trails. I thought it'd be the perfect getaway, an opportunity to clear my head before the winter months rolled in. The forest was dense, the towering pines creating an endless canopy overhead. As the sun set behind the hills, the temperature dropped quickly, and the shadows stretched like dark fingers across the trail. I found a flat clearing near a small creek and set up camp just as twilight sank into full night. The silence of the forest was thicker than usual, almost oppressive, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't long before I started hearing things, faint, distant sounds, almost like whispers. At first, I brushed it off. The woods can play tricks on you, and I figured it was just the wind rustling through the branches. But as the night wore on, the noises became more distinct. Low, murmured conversations, too faint to make out, but unmistakably human. I looked around, shining my flashlight through the trees, but the beam was swallowed up by the darkness. "It's just your mind playing games," I told myself. "You're alone out here. No one else is around." Still, the whispers persisted. They grew louder as the night deepened, closer. My heart started racing, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I stoked the fire, trying to calm myself, but the flames felt small, almost like they were shrinking, struggling against the darkness that pressed in around me. Around midnight, I heard a distinct sound, a twig snapping just beyond the edge of the firelight. I froze, staring into the blackness. My flashlight, flickering weakly, illuminated nothing but trees. I strained my ears, listening, and that's when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud, too thin in the quiet. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but I felt watched. You know that prickling sensation on your skin when someone's eyes are on you? It was like that, only 1,000 times worse. My stomach twisted in knots, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run. But something about the heaviness in the air kept me rooted to the spot. Then, just as I was convincing myself to pack up and leave, the footsteps started again, this time faster, coming straight toward me. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, expecting to see an animal, maybe a deer. But what I saw was far worse. It was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, its eyes, were black holes, empty and soulless. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring at me. I felt paralyzed, like my legs were rooted to the ground. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't. Suddenly, the figure moved. Fast. Too fast. Disappearing into the trees with a rush of wind that extinguished the fire. I was plunged into complete darkness, and in the silence that followed, the whispers came back. This time they were all around me, echoing from every direction, louder and clearer now. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. And they were calling my name. Panicked, I grabbed my pack and stumbled through the darkness, trying to find the trail. The whispers followed, always just behind me, always calling, growing more frantic the deeper I ran into the woods. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found myself back at the creek, back at my campsite. I had been running in circles. I collapsed next to the cold fire pit, out of breath, heart pounding. The whispers had stopped, but I knew. I wasn't alone. In the pale moonlight, I noticed something strange. My backpack. It wasn't mine. It looked exactly like mine, same color, same patches, but the wear was different, the fabric older, more frayed. And then I saw it. Carved into the leather strap was a name. My name. I don't remember doing it, but my hands shook as I reached inside, pulling out a crumpled, yellowed photograph. It was a picture of me, only it wasn't. The face was mine, but the clothes were old, out of place like something from decades ago. And behind me in the photo stood the figure, the same one I had seen in the clearing, its hollow eyes locked on me. My blood ran cold as I turned the photo over. Scrawled in faded ink were the words, "He will bring you back." Suddenly, I understood. The whispers, the figure, the way the woods seemed to shift around me. I wasn't the first one to experience this, and I wouldn't be the last. Something was keeping me here. Something wanted me here. I don't know how I made it out of those woods, but I did. When I finally stumbled out, the sun was rising, casting the forest in a dull, eerie glow. But the feeling of being watched never left. Now, even as I sit here in the safety of my home, I can still feel those eyes on me, that presence lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. They're getting louder, and they're calling my name. I don't know why I thought solo camping would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress of work, the constant buzz of my phone, or the weight of everyday life grinding me down. I needed to get away from it all, just for a weekend. I needed the peace and quiet of the wilderness. I chose a spot far off the beaten path, deep in a national forest where the nearest trail was miles away. It was just me, my tent, and the woods. The drive was long, but once I parked and started the hike, the air felt fresher, the silence more profound. No more people, no more noise, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. It was perfect. I set up my tent near a small stream and built a fire as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. The crackling flames were the only sound as I sat there, alone but comfortable, the quiet exactly what I'd been craving. But as the night closed in, the sense of isolation grew heavier. By the time the fire was nothing but glowing embers, the forest was pitch black. The only light came from the stars, dimly visible through the treetops. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay back in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. It was peaceful at first, just the usual forest noises, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets. But then, sometime after midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had jolted me out of sleep. At first I thought it was just the disorienting quiet, the absence of the familiar city sounds. But then I heard it, a distant, rhythmic tapping, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a natural sound like an animal moving through the brush. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I listened, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch tapping against a tree moved by the wind, but there was no wind. The air was still, unnervingly so. The tapping continued, slow and steady. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, but as I listened, it grew louder, as if it was getting closer. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but none came. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear beyond the thin walls of the tent. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself had gone still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that I was alone and it was all in my head. But then I heard something new. Footsteps. Faint at first, but growing louder. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly over the dry leaves and twigs. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods, getting closer to my camp. Panic surged through me. I reached for the flashlight I'd left beside my sleeping bag and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent. But out there, beyond the fabric walls, everything was black. I unzipped the tent just a fraction, enough to peer out. The fire was completely out now, and the moonlight barely illuminated the clearing. My eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the dense, dark forest pressing in on all sides. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the faint moonlight, there was a figure, standing still. Too still. At first I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but no. It was shaped like a person. It was just standing there, at the tree line, motionless. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness, hoping I was seeing things. But no, it was still there, just standing, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadowy silhouette against the trees. For a long, heart-pounding moment, neither of us moved. My mind raced. Who was out here, this deep in the forest? I hadn't seen a single person since I started the hike. This area wasn't even on most maps. It didn't make sense. I didn't know what to do. My gear was scattered around the campsite, my car miles away. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows. And then slowly it stepped forward. The sound of its footsteps breaking the silence was like a gunshot. It moved slowly, one deliberate step at a time, as if it had all the time in the world. I panicked. I zipped the tent shut and backed away, flashlight shaking in my hand, casting erratic beams of light around the small space. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to think, tried to figure out what to do. The footsteps grew louder. I sat there frozen, flashlight pointed at the tent flap, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I listened, my breath shallow, waiting for the next sound. But there was nothing. Just silence. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I gathered the courage to peek out again. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty, just as it had been when I first arrived. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, wide awake, flashlight in hand, waiting for the figure to return, but it never did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as fast as I could and hiked back to my car without looking back. I don't know what or who that figure was, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there, and I'm never camping alone again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, that gives me a strange sense of peace. But that night, that trip, it changed everything. I had decided to go camping alone, something I'd done many times before. It was late autumn, and the leaves had turned a deep orange and red, creating a canopy of colors above me as I hiked through the forest. I had picked a remote spot near a lake I'd heard about from some locals, about 2 hours north of the nearest town. Quiet and peaceful, they said. Perfect. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, creeping shadows through the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and lit a small fire. The crackling of the wood was the only sound in the forest. No birds, no wind, just silence. At first I enjoyed it, but as the darkness deepened, the quiet began to feel oppressive, like the trees were watching me, waiting for something. I told myself it was just my imagination and settled into my tent after the fire died down. That's when I first heard it, a soft rustling outside, barely noticeable, like something small moving through the underbrush. I sat up, straining to listen, my heart beating faster. Maybe it was a raccoon or some small animal. But then the sound stopped, replaced by a heavy, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening as they moved closer to my tent, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't care about being heard. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind that had suddenly picked up. The footsteps stopped too. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, curious about my camp. But as I zipped the tent back up, I noticed something strange. All around my campsite, the forest was still again, unnaturally so. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. Hours passed, and just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time, closer. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps circled the tent, slowly, deliberately, and then stopped right by my head. I gripped the flashlight, ready to shine it out, but something told me not to. I didn't want to know what was out there. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent. I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then a voice, a low, raspy whisper, like someone speaking right into my ear from the other side of the tent wall. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an animal. Someone was out there, messing with me. I scrambled for my phone, my hand shaking as I tried to unlock it. Before I could call anyone, the whispering stopped and a loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. My tent shuddered like something massive had brushed up against it. I bolted upright, tearing through the zipper and stumbling out into the darkness. I shone my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Just trees, tall and looming, casting long shadows in the dim light. The growl came again, this time from the direction of the lake. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what to do, where to go. I was alone, miles from civilization, with no help coming. But then, something changed. The air grew cold, unnaturally cold for autumn, and I noticed something near the edge of the lake, barely visible in the mist that had started to roll in. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless. I tried to focus the flashlight, but the beam flickered, dimming as if the battery was dying. The figure began to move, slow and jerky, like it wasn't used to walking. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted through the trees, the ground uneven and littered with roots. Behind me I could hear those footsteps again, faster now, keeping pace with me. I didn't dare look back. I ran for what felt like hours, until I reached a road, a small dirt path that I hadn't even known existed. Collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath, I looked back into the forest. Nothing, no figure, no footsteps, just the wind rustling the trees. I managed to get back to my car and drive straight home, shaking the entire way. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had spooked myself out. But then, a few days later, I heard something that still makes my skin crawl. I was telling a friend about the trip when he interrupted me. That lake, did you say it was near Mason Ridge? I nodded, confused. He went pale. People don't go there anymore, he said quietly. Not since that hiker went missing a few years back. They found his camp, but not him. His stuff was still there, untouched, and his tent. It was slashed open from the inside. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I hadn't heard about the missing hiker before. But now every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder, was I really alone out there? Or did I come too close to the same fate? And I still don't know what I heard or saw that night, but I'll never go back. Some places are better left alone. We were 6 hours deep into the forest when we finally set up camp. The sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long, creeping shadows across the ground. I was with my best friends, Mike, Sarah, Jenna, and Paul, and we were ready for a weekend of total disconnect. No phones, no distractions, just the 5 of us, a campfire, and miles of wilderness. It was Mike's idea to camp out here, a place called Blackwood Forest. None of us had heard of it before, but Mike swore he'd seen it online, a hidden gem, remote, untouched, the perfect escape. By the time we got the fire going, the woods were already dark. The kind of darkness that wraps around you makes you feel small. Sarah pulled out her guitar, strumming lazily while the rest of us sat around the fire talking and laughing. For a while, everything was perfect, peaceful even. Then, just as Jenna was telling a story, we heard it. A snap, like a twig breaking. We all froze, our eyes darting into the trees. At first, we brushed it off. It's a forest, right? Could have been an animal. But it was followed by another snap, and then another, closer. Paul stood up, his face set in that familiar, overconfident grin. Relax. It's probably a deer or something, he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the noise. The beam of light barely pierced the blackness. We waited in tense silence, listening to Paul call out, "Here, Bambi, Bambi," mocking the tension. But then he stopped. The light clicked off and there was nothing but silence. We called his name, once, twice, but no answer. Mike stood up, worry creeping across his face. "Paul, man, quit screwing around." Still nothing. The seconds stretched into minutes. My pulse started racing. Then Paul came running back into the firelight, his face pale. There's something out there," he panted. His voice cracked in a way that made my stomach drop. Before we could question him, a low guttural growl came from the trees. It wasn't the growl of any animal I knew. It was deep, unnatural, like something big, something watching us. We doused the fire quickly, plunging the campsite into darkness, hoping whatever it was would lose interest. But the noises continued, crunching leaves, the sound of something huge moving just out of sight, circling. Sarah whispered, "We need to leave. Now." No one argued. We packed up as fast as we could, our breaths coming quick and shallow, the sounds in the woods growing louder, closer. But every time we thought we were ready to run, another noise would stop us dead in our tracks, a scraping like claws against bark, or the faintest of whispers carried on the wind. We finally started hiking back, but it was slow going. Our flashlights barely illuminated the narrow trail, and the sense of being watched never left. In fact, it grew stronger. Every now and then, I swore I saw something moving just out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Just black. Then we stumbled upon it, a clearing that wasn't there before. We had hiked this trail earlier in the day, and there hadn't been any clearing like this. It was strange, perfectly circular, as if something had cleared it by force. In the center was a large, ancient-looking stone, half buried in the ground. Symbols were carved into it. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that made my skin crawl, just looking at them. "What the hell is this?" Mike whispered, but none of us had an answer. We all stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Then we saw the figures. At the edge of the clearing, standing motionless, were shapes, human-like but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. "We need to go," Sarah said again, her voice shaking, but something kept us rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like something was holding me there, forcing me to stay. That's when I noticed it, the markings on the stone. They weren't just random symbols. They were faces, and one of them was mine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and looked at the others. Their faces were there too. We had been marked. I don't remember much of what happened next. Everything became a blur of running, the shadows moving closer, the figures breaking the tree line, coming for us. My legs burned as I sprinted, my lungs screaming for air. We didn't stop until we reached the car, breathless, terrified. We drove all night, silent, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. When we finally made it back to civilization, no one spoke of the figures, the stone, or the fact that we had been marked. Weeks passed, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe we had escaped. But then Paul went missing, and Jenna. One by one, they disappeared. No traces, no clues, just gone. Now I'm the last one left. I haven't slept in days. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The figures, standing at the edge of the clearing, waiting. I know they'll come for me soon, because sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I hear it again. That low, unnatural growl coming from the darkness. I had always loved camping. There was something about being far away from the city, with nothing but the quiet rustling of the trees and the crackling fire, that made me feel at peace. So when my friend Jack invited me to join him for a weekend deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate. We'd camped before, but this time felt different. He'd found a spot, way off the beaten path, nestled near a forgotten lake. We arrived late in the afternoon, the golden sunlight spilling through the canopy of towering pines. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. No other campers in sight. It was perfect. As we set up camp, the only sounds were the birds above and the occasional rustle of the wind. By the time night fell, a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest floor, creeping between the trees like ghostly fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I pushed it aside. Probably just my imagination. Jack was laughing, joking about the horror movies we watched too much of, and it helped lighten the mood. For a while. The fire flickered as we sat in silence, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythm. The crackle of the flames, the chirp of distant crickets, and the faint whisper of the wind were comforting. But then a new sound pierced the stillness, a low guttural groan, almost like the moan of a dying animal coming from deep within the woods. Jack looked at me, his smile fading. "What do you think that was?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a deer or something." But as the minutes passed, the sounds grew louder. Not just the groaning, but twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was moving out there, and they were getting closer. I strained my ears, focusing on the sounds, but it was like whatever it was knew how to stay, just beyond the edge of the firelight, concealed by the swirling fog. "We should check it out," Jack said suddenly, grabbing a flashlight. I wasn't so sure. Every instinct screamed at me to stay by the fire, but I didn't want to look like a coward. "Yeah, let's go." We stepped into the forest, the darkness immediately swallowing us. The beam of Jack's flashlight cut through the mist, but it barely penetrated the dense blackness beyond. The sound had stopped. We wandered for a while, listening, but all we could hear was our own breathing and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. Then, without warning, the air changed. It felt thicker, heavier. There was a strange smell, like something rotting, and I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no insects, just nothing. "Jack," I whispered, but he didn't respond. I turned and realized he wasn't beside me. Panic surged through my chest. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight across the trees, but there was no sign of him. "Jack!" I called out, louder this time, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. I ran back toward the campsite, my breath quickening. The fog had grown thicker, the trees bending in ways that felt unnatural, their shadows long and distorted. Finally, I broke through the tree line, back into the clearing. The fire was still burning, but Jack was nowhere in sight. That's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the fog, standing completely still. It was tall, too tall to be Jack, and its limbs were unnaturally long, almost stretched. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure slowly turned its head toward me. Even in the dim light, I could see that its face wasn't right. Its eyes were hollow, and its skin seemed to hang off its bones like wet paper. It let out a low, guttural moan, the same sound we'd heard earlier, and started moving toward me. But not walking. It was gliding, smoothly, silently, through the mist. I backed away, nearly tripping over the fire pit, and turned to run, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jack, lying on the ground, face down, his body twisted in a way that no living person could survive. But it wasn't Jack, at least not anymore. His body twitched, then started to move, slowly pulling itself upright. His head lolled to the side, and his eyes, they were gone. Just empty sockets, staring into nothingness. The figure was closer now. I could feel it behind me. Its breath, if it even breathed, chilling the back of my neck. I turned, but it was too late. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, trees whipping past as I ran, a deep, unearthly laugh that echoed in my ears, and that same rotting smell filling my lungs. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but somehow I did. I didn't look back, not once. It's been days since then, and I've barely slept. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that groaning, feel that presence watching me. I know it's still out there, and I think it's getting closer. I had always loved camping, especially the feeling of disconnecting from the world and immersing myself in nature. This trip was supposed to be no different. It was just me and my buddy Mark, heading out to a remote spot we found on an old hiking forum, the kind of place where GPS signals die and cell reception is non-existent. Perfect for a weekend getaway, right? The drive took us deep into the mountains, far away from any towns or people. As we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The trees felt ancient, looming over us like silent sentinels. There was an eerie stillness in the air, but we shrugged it off. It was just nature after all. We hiked for about an hour before we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a wide, flat patch of earth surrounded by thick woods on all sides, and beyond the trees, we could hear the faint sound of a stream trickling nearby. It seemed perfect. We pitched our tent, started a fire, and settled in for a quiet night under the stars. But as night fell, that stillness I noticed earlier turned into something else, a kind of suffocating silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of crickets. Mark joked about it being too quiet, but I could tell he felt it too. Around midnight, we started hearing the noises. At first, it was just a light rustling in the bushes. Probably a raccoon or something, we thought. But then there was a strange clicking sound, like two stones being tapped together. It was slow, rhythmic, coming from the edge of the tree line. We both fell silent, listening. The sound continued for a few minutes, then stopped suddenly. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was just some weird animal, but I could hear the unease in his voice. We both stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. The clicking came back. This time it was closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the trees, but the beam only seemed to deepen the darkness. The shadows felt thicker, like they were moving just out of view. And then, just as quickly as it started, the clicking stopped again. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. We sat by the fire for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, Mark suggested we call it a night and head into the tent. Maybe if we ignored it, whatever it was would go away. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the tent, every gust of wind, it all sounded too close, too deliberate. I could hear Mark tossing and turning beside me, just as restless. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up to a noise that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching the leaves just outside the tent. They were slow, like someone was walking around, taking their time, inspecting us. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, long, deep breaths. Something or someone was standing just inches from us. Then came the scraping. It was a soft, slow drag, like nails or claws raking against the fabric of the tent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. Mark was awake too. I could hear him muttering under his breath, "What the hell is that?" We stayed still, paralyzed by fear, as the scraping continued. Then suddenly it stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. The silence returned, but this time it felt even worse. Like something was watching, waiting. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the tent, wide-eyed, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Without saying a word, we packed up camp as quickly as we could, eager to leave whatever had stalked us during the night. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt different, more alive, but in a wrong kind of way. The birds were back, the wind rustled through the trees, but that feeling of being watched never left. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What could we even say? But before we left the mountains, we made one stop at a small diner on the edge of the nearest town. We were desperate to shake off the dread, to feel normal again. As we sat there sipping coffee, we overheard a conversation between two locals at the counter. "Did you hear they found another body up in the woods near Dead Man's Creek?" one of them said. My blood ran cold. "Yeah, second one this month. Sheriff thinks it's a bear, but I don't know," the other replied. "Folks around here say it's something else. Something older." I exchanged a look with Mark, and we didn't need to say anything. We both knew. whatever was out there that night. It wasn't just an animal. It was something watching us, hunting us, and we were lucky to have made it out alive. Now every time I hear the click of stones, I remember that night in the woods, and I wonder how close we came to being the next ones they found. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me, my tent, and the silence of the wilderness. I'd been camping for years, and I knew the spots that guaranteed seclusion, where you could be miles away from another soul. Pine Hollow was one of those places. Nestled deep in the forest, it was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that stretched high into the sky, their dark needles swaying gently in the wind. Perfect, I thought. Exactly what I needed. The first night started off serene. The campfire crackled softly as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. I could hear the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Nothing unusual, just nature doing its thing. The sky was pitch black now, save for the small pinpricks of stars that peeked through the gaps in the canopy above. I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped up my tent, feeling that familiar sense of calm wash over me. But that calm didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise outside the tent, a low rustling sound like someone or something was moving through the underbrush just outside. I listened closely, heart thudding in my chest, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer. It was too faint to be anything larger, too inconsistent to be a person. I convinced myself it was nothing and rolled over, trying to fall back asleep. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering. It was so quiet at first I thought it was the wind, but then it became clearer. Soft voices, like a conversation being carried on the breeze. They were coming from just beyond the tree line, too far away for me to make out the words, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. I sat up, straining my ears to catch more, but the whispers stopped, as if they knew I was listening. I told myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I unzipped the tent and peeked out, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting eerie shadows across the campsite. The forest was still, too still. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just silence. I quickly zipped the tent back up and laid down, pulling my sleeping bag up to my neck like a kid afraid of the dark. My mind raced, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything felt off. The air was heavy, like it had a weight to it, pressing down on me. The trees around my campsite seemed darker, more foreboding, and every now and then I could swear I saw movement in the corners of my vision. But when I turned to look, nothing. The whole forest felt like it was watching me. I decided to explore a bit, hoping to shake the unease. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I found something strange. A circle of stones, arranged in a perfect ring, with charred bits of wood in the center. It looked like an old fire pit, but it hadn't been there the day before. I'd scouted this area thoroughly when I set up camp. There was no way I could have missed it. Suddenly, the forest around me felt suffocating. The trees, once majestic, now seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches reaching down like claws. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The whispering started again, faint and distant but unmistakable. This time it sounded like it was coming from all directions, as if the forest itself was speaking in hushed tones. I ran back to camp, heart pounding, only to find that things had been moved. My backpack, which I had left inside my tent, was now lying next to the fire pit, open, with all of its contents spilled out. My water bottles had been emptied, and my food was scattered across the ground, untouched by animals. It was as if someone had gone through my things and then left, deliberately trying to unnerve me. I knew I had to leave. I hastily packed up my gear and started hiking back to the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just trees standing silent and still. As I neared the edge of Pine Hollow, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt just ahead of me were footprints, bare human footprints. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still crumbling. I knelt down to get a closer look, and that's when I realized something horrifying. The footprints were mine, but they weren't leading back the way I had come. They were leading deeper into the forest, back towards my campsite. I stood up, heart racing, and took a step backward. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening, like a chorus of voices just beyond my hearing. I looked down at the trail again, and my footprints were gone. The dirt was smooth, untouched, as if no one had ever walked there. Panic surged through me and I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore, I just ran, branches whipping at my face, the whispering growing louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my head. I could hear my own breath, ragged and desperate, mixing with the voices. I don't know how long I ran before I broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the gravel road where my car was parked. The forest behind me was still, silent once more, but I didn't trust it. I jumped into my car and sped down the road, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was me. Or at least it looked like me. Same clothes, same face, same eyes. But it was just standing there, watching, with a cold, empty expression, unmoving as I disappeared into the distance. I've never been back to Pine Hollow, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the whispering. And every now and then, I catch a glimpse of someone in the mirror, a figure standing just behind me with my face, but I know it's not me, not really. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything, a chance to clear my head and get some peace. I'd heard about a place, a hidden spot off the main trails deep in Black Pine Forest. Not many people went there, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted to be alone, just me in the wilderness. That's the kind of escape I needed. The drive took longer than I expected, winding down forgotten roads that seemed to get narrower the further I went. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. I grabbed my pack, checked my map, and started the hike to the campsite. The trail was overgrown and barely visible, but I didn't mind. That was part of the adventure. After about 2 hours, I found a small clearing beside a river, the kind of spot that felt untouched by time. The trees here were taller, their trunks thick and dark, and their branches twisted together in a tangled canopy overhead. The light that filtered through was dim, even though the sun was still up. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the shadows grew long, and the forest around me seemed to deepen, becoming almost unnervingly quiet. But I was used to being alone in the woods. A little quiet never bothered me, or so I thought. After dinner, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the gentle rush of the river nearby. For a while, it was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But as the night grew darker, that strange, creeping sensation of being watched began to creep in. I couldn't explain it. It was like the forest had suddenly gotten heavier, like the trees themselves were pressing in on me. I told myself it was just the solitude, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked out into the darkness beyond the firelight, I felt like something was there. Just beyond where the light faded into the thick woods, I swore I saw movement. A shadow, maybe, something that wasn't quite right. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing. Just the tangled mess of branches and the thick underbrush. I tried to laugh it off, shaking my head at how easily I was spooking myself. I'd spent plenty of nights alone in the woods before. This was no different, except it was. The fire burned low, and I decided to call it a night. I banked the flames, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. Lying there, cocooned in my sleeping bag, I listened to the stillness. It was unnerving, too quiet. No wind, no insects, no rustling of leaves. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to grow thicker as the night wore on. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard it, the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I realized it wasn't moving like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. Heavy footsteps, crunching softly in the dirt and leaves. Whatever it was walking around the perimeter of my campsite just outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled closer and closer. I didn't dare move. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it almost deafening in the quiet. The footsteps stopped directly beside my tent, just inches from where I lay. I could hear the soft rustling of fabric as something, or someone, brushed against the nylon. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly in my shaking hand, and slowly turned it on, aiming it toward the tent wall. The light illuminated the inside of the tent, casting strange shadows on the walls, but I couldn't see anything outside. And then I heard breathing. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Slow, steady breaths, just outside the tent, as if someone was standing there, watching me. My mouth went dry, my body rigid with fear. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. For what felt like hours, I lay there, frozen, listening to that slow, rhythmic breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I waited, my heart still pounding in my ears, but the footsteps didn't return. Slowly, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just a little, shining my flashlight out into the darkness. Nothing. The campsite was empty. I sat up, my body trembling with adrenaline. I listened for any sound, any hint of movement, but the forest was silent again. Whatever or whoever had been out there was gone. At least that's what I told myself. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up camp in a hurry, stuffing my gear into my pack and dousing the fire. I didn't care about breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The uneasy feeling of being watched had never left me, and I was sure as I hiked back to the trailhead that something was following me. Every now and then I would stop, turn, and listen. I never saw anything, but the forest felt different. The shadows were darker, the trees more twisted. The silence was oppressive, like the forest itself was waiting for something. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my pack into the back seat and started the engine, ready to leave that place behind. But as I pulled onto the narrow road, I glanced in my rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the forest just beyond where the trees met the road was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body pale and barely visible in the early morning light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I blinked and it was gone. I floored the gas, speeding down the winding road, trying to shake the image from my mind. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that something had followed me out of the woods. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't forget what happened. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside my window, and every time I look, there's nothing there. Just the faint rustling of the wind through the trees, and the oppressive silence that's followed me ever since. I had never been the kind of person who camped alone. It wasn't out of fear. I wasn't some easily spooked city kid. I just preferred having someone with me to share the silence, the stars, the crackling fire. But when my girlfriend and I broke up, I found myself craving isolation. A weekend alone in the woods seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. So I borrowed a tent, packed my gear, and drove 2 hours into the mountains, to a spot I'd heard about from some hikers online. It was a remote location, deep in a forest where the trees grew thick and the trails were barely marked, perfect for some time away from everything. The drive up was uneventful, the sun was still high, the road was dusty, and the sky was a clear, deep blue. As I drove further from civilization, my mind started to relax. No more distractions, no more people, just me and nature. I parked at the trailhead, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started the hike. The trail was rougher than I expected, narrow with roots and rocks jutting out every few steps, but the fresh air and solitude made it worthwhile. By the time I reached the clearing where I'd planned to set up camp, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long golden shadows over the ground. I set up the tent quickly, gathered some wood for a fire, and sat down with a sense of satisfaction. It was peaceful, just like I'd wanted. The forest around me was quiet, the air cool and still. I stared at the flames, letting the warmth and the gentle crackling soothe my thoughts. But then, as the sky darkened and the stars started to appear, the quiet became too quiet. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, had all but vanished. It wasn't something I noticed right away, but when I did, it unsettled me. I brushed it off. It's normal, I told myself. Animals go quiet at night. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence seemed to press in on me, like the forest was holding its breath. Suddenly there was a sound, a distant snap of a branch. I froze, staring into the trees, straining to see past the ring of light from my fire. I saw nothing, just shadows. Probably a deer, I thought. Maybe a raccoon. But the sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate crunch of leaves followed by another like footsteps. Slow, measured. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing, just the crackle of the fire. I waited, listening, my heart starting to race. It had to be an animal. There was no way someone else would be out here, not this far off the trail. Then, from the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight, I heard a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. "Help." My skin went cold. The voice was weak, trembling, like someone was lost or injured. I stood up, peering into the blackness. "Hello? Are you okay? Where are you?" Silence. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees. The beam flickered over the trunks and bushes, but there was no one. I swept the light from side to side, my pulse quickening. "Please." The voice again, closer now, just at the edge of the clearing. I took a step forward, shining the light toward where I thought the sound was coming from. "I'm here," I called. "Do you need help?" For a long moment there was no response, and then the voice again, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Come here." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay by the fire, to stay in the light. But the voice, there was something so desperate, so fragile about it. Someone could be hurt, I reasoned. Lost. Alone. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward the trees, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Where are you?" I called again. Silence. The only sound was my boots crunching on the leaves. I moved deeper into the woods, away from the fire. The trees were thicker here, the darkness almost suffocating. My flashlight beam flickered, and for a second I thought I saw movement, a shape slipping between the trees, low to the ground. "Hello?" My voice wavered. Then suddenly the voice was behind me. Closer. I spun around, shining the flashlight back toward the clearing, but there was no one there. Just trees, the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. That's when I realized the voice wasn't coming from a person. It was coming from everywhere. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping, whispering, surrounding me. Panic shot through me, and I turned to run back to the fire, but before I could take a step, something cold brushed against my arm. I froze. Slowly, I lifted the flashlight, shining it toward the source of the touch. There in the shadows, just inches from me, was a hand, pale, thin, with fingers too long, reaching out from between the trees. It wasn't attached to a body. It wasn't attached to anything. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my throat. The hand twitched, its fingers curling like it was beckoning me, and then the voice whispering closer than ever. "Stay with us." I turned and ran, my feet barely finding the trail as I sprinted back toward the camp. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "Stay. Stay with us." I burst into the clearing, my chest heaving, and scrambled to throw dirt on the fire. The whispers grew frantic, like 1,000 voices all around me, desperate and angry. "Stay, stay!" I grabbed my backpack and ran, not daring to look back. The whispers didn't stop until I reached the car, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. As I peeled out of the dirt lot, I could still hear them, faint but clear, carried on the wind through the trees. Come back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the mountain far behind me. It wasn't until I pulled over on the side of the road, trying to catch my breath, that I realized something was horribly wrong. In the rearview mirror reflected in the back seat was the same hand, pale, thin, and waiting.